The Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment is one of the most well-known and controversial studies in the history of psychology, conducted in 1971 by social psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University. It was designed to investigate the psychological effects of perceived power and authority, particularly how individuals conform to roles of guard and prisoner in a simulated prison environment. The study aimed to explore the situational versus dispositional factors that influence behavior, testing whether abusive behavior in prisons was primarily a result of the personalities of the guards and prisoners or the structure and environment of the prison system itself. The experiment recruited 24 healthy, psychologically stable male college students who were randomly assigned to either the role of prisoner or guard in a mock prison constructed in the basement of Stanford's psychology department. Participants were screened to eliminate those with any history of psychological disorders, criminal behavior, or health problems, ensuring a relatively homogeneous and mentally stable group. The mock prison was carefully designed to mimic the conditions of a real correctional facility, complete with barred cells, a solitary confinement room, and areas designated for guards. Participants assigned to the prisoner role were unexpectedly arrested at their homes by actual police officers, booked, fingerprinted, and transported to the simulated prison to enhance realism and psychological immersion. Prisoners were stripped, deloused, given prison uniforms with identification numbers, and instructed to follow strict rules. Guards were provided with khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, to prevent eye contact and create psychological distance, batons, and complete authority over the prisoners, though they were instructed not to use physical violence. Zimbardo himself assumed the role of prison superintendent, observing the interactions and overseeing the experiment. The initial plan was for the study to last 2 weeks, but it was terminated after only 6 days due to the rapid and extreme behavioral changes exhibited by participants. Almost immediately, the experiment demonstrated the powerful influence of situational factors on behavior. Within a short period, guards began to adopt authoritarian and, in many cases, sadistic behaviors toward the prisoners, enforcing arbitrary rules, subjecting them to psychological humiliation, and devising creative punishments. Some guards displayed escalating levels of cruelty, exploiting their authority in ways that shocked both the researchers and outside observers. Prisoners, on the other hand, quickly became passive, submissive, and emotionally distressed. Many exhibited signs of severe stress, depression, and anxiety. Some attempted to rebel early on, staging a hunger strike and barricading themselves in their cells, but these acts were met with harsh retaliation by guards, including solitary confinement and intensified humiliation. Over time, prisoners appeared to internalize their roles, losing their sense of individuality and personal agency, while guards increasingly embraced their dominant status. The experiment spiraled so far that even Zimbardo himself, acting as the superintendent, became absorbed in the simulation, failing initially to recognize the ethical and psychological harm occurring. It was only after an outside observer, graduate student Christina Maslach, strongly objected to the treatment of prisoners and the deteriorating conditions that Zimbardo decided to terminate the study. By that time, multiple prisoners had experienced emotional breakdowns, and the boundary between reality and role-playing had become dangerously blurred for many participants. The Stanford Prison Experiment provided dramatic evidence for the power of situational forces and social roles in shaping behavior. It supported the idea that ordinary individuals, placed in positions of authority and given ambiguous norms, can engage in behavior that violates their personal morals. The results aligned with concepts such as de-individuation, loss of self-awareness in groups, conformity to social roles, and the influence of institutional structures on behavior, illustrating that the environment and social expectations can override individual personality traits. Zimbardo argued that the study revealed a situational attribution of behavior rather than a purely dispositional one, challenging the view that abusive acts are committed only by inherently sadistic or aggressive people. However, the experiment has been the subject of significant ethical criticism and methodological scrutiny. Ethically, it violated principles of informed consent and the obligation to protect participants from harm, as individuals were subjected to intense psychological stress and humiliation without proper safeguards. The lack of clear guidelines, the absence of adequate intervention when harm became apparent, and Zimbardo's dual role as researcher and prison superintendent compromised the integrity of the study. In the years following, the experiment has been widely cited as an example of why stringent ethical standards, such as those outlined by the American Psychological Association, are essential in psychological research. Methodologically, the study has been criticized for lack of scientific rigor, including issues of demand characteristics, participants possibly acting in ways they believed were expected, the influence of Zimbardo's instructions on guard behavior, and the absence of a control group. Some scholars argue that the behavior of guards was partly shaped by explicit or implicit cues from the experimenters, rather than arising entirely from situational dynamics. In addition, the small and homogeneous sample limits the generalizability of the findings. Despite these criticisms, the Stanford prison experiment remains a cornerstone in discussions of social psychology, authority, and ethics. It has influenced theories of institutional behavior, informed prison reform debates, and shaped public understanding of how context and power structures can lead to moral disengagement. It also resonates with historical and contemporary examples of systemic abuse, such as those observed in military prisons and totalitarian regimes, reinforcing the lesson that under certain conditions, ordinary people can perpetrate extraordinary harm. Ultimately, the Stanford prison experiment is both a profound demonstration of the malleability of human behavior under situational pressures and a cautionary tale about the ethical responsibilities of researchers. It underscores the necessity of understanding social roles, authority, and systemic factors when analyzing human actions, while serving as a stark reminder of how easily environments can shape and distort moral judgment. Illusion of truth effect. The illusion of truth effect is a psychological phenomenon in which repeated exposure to a statement increases the likelihood that people will judge it as true, regardless of its actual accuracy. Simply put, the more familiar a claim feels, the more credible it seems. This occurs not because individuals carefully evaluate evidence each time they hear something, but because the mind unconsciously equates familiarity with validity. A statement that has been heard multiple times produces a sense of cognitive ease, a feeling that the information is fluent, easy to process, and therefore trustworthy. This illusion can make even false information seem believable if it is repeated often enough. The roots of the effect lie in the way human cognition processes information. When a person encounters a claim for the first time, they may evaluate it critically, questioning whether it aligns with prior knowledge. However, each subsequent exposure requires less effort to process, because the brain recognizes it as familiar. This fluency creates a subtle, positive affective signal that the brain mistakes for accuracy. Psychologists have shown that people are often unaware of this mental shortcut, and even when explicitly warned that repetition does not guarantee truth, they still fall victim to the effect. In experiments, participants rate repeated statements as more credible than new ones, even when both were identified as false earlier. The mechanism operates automatically, bypassing deliberate reasoning, and illustrates how easily memory and judgment can be biased by familiarity. This phenomenon has significant consequences in everyday life. In the realm of advertising, repeated slogans, product claims, or brand messages become more believable simply because they are familiar, leading consumers to trust and prefer them without consciously realizing why. In politics and propaganda, the repetition of certain narratives, slogans, or talking points can implant the illusion of truth, gradually shaping public opinion. Even in casual conversation, rumors and myths spread through repetition, gaining an aura of credibility the more often they are heard. The effect demonstrates why misinformation, once circulated widely, is so difficult to correct. A falsehood repeated enough times can feel truer than a rarely heard fact. Cognitively, The illusion of truth effect highlights the tension between System 1 and System 2 thinking, to use Daniel Kahneman's terms. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and relies on mental shortcuts such as fluency, while System 2 is slower, effortful, and engages in deliberate reasoning. The illusion of truth thrives when System 1 dominates judgment, since people rely on the feeling of familiarity rather than verifying facts through deeper analysis. To override the effect requires conscious, effortful thinking, cross-checking claims, seeking evidence, and resisting the pull of fluency. Yet because human attention is limited, and because the brain often seeks cognitive ease rather than strain, people frequently default to System 1, allowing repeated falsehoods to take root. In psychological research, the effect has been consistently observed. Early studies demonstrated that participants presented with both true and false statements rated repeated false statements as increasingly believable over time. Later experiments showed that even when participants were explicitly told that certain claims were false, repetition still inflated their perceived credibility. This persistence underscores the automatic nature of the process. Neuroscientific findings suggest that fluency activates regions of the brain associated with positive affect and processing ease, creating a subtle emotional signal that overrides more rational evaluation. The illusion of truth effect also interacts with memory. People often misremember the source of information while retaining the statement itself. Over time, the tag that indicated whether the information was true or false fades, but the statement remains familiar. This source amnesia means that repeated falsehoods are stripped of their context and judged on their familiarity alone, further reinforcing the illusion. This explains why myths, once learned, are hard to unlearn. Even when debunked, the repetition itself cements them in memory. The phenomenon carries important implications for modern society. In an age where information spreads rapidly through digital media, repetition occurs at unprecedented scales. False claims, conspiracy theories, or misleading headlines can be amplified across platforms, becoming familiar to millions before corrective information has a chance to reach them. The illusion of truth effect means that once familiarity sets in, debunking is often insufficient, since the repeated claim continues to feel true. This presents challenges for education, journalism, and critical thinking, requiring strategies not just to correct misinformation but to prevent it from becoming familiar in the first place. At its core, the illusion of truth effect demonstrates how the human mind prioritizes efficiency over accuracy. By equating familiarity with truth, the brain saves energy but leaves itself vulnerable to error. What feels true is not always what is true, and repetition can mask falsehood as fact. This insight reveals both a cognitive vulnerability and a social responsibility, to be aware of how easily truth can be distorted, to actively question what feels familiar, and to recognize that comfort and fluency are not substitutes for evidence. Affective forecasting error. Affective forecasting error is the systematic mismatch between the emotional states people expect to feel in the future and the emotional states they actually experience when that future arrives. People are surprisingly poor at predicting both how strongly an event will make them feel, intensity, and how long that feeling will last, duration. As a result, we frequently make choices about careers, relationships, purchases, health, or policy based on faulty emotional predictions. We buy things we think will make us much happier than they actually do, dread events far more than necessary, or over or underprepare because our imagined feelings don't match reality. At the heart of the phenomenon are several interacting cognitive and affective processes. When people simulate a future event, they typically construct a simplified, schematic scenario focused on the most salient features. This mental simulation often omits mundane but powerful influences, other life events, the return of everyday routines, coping strategies, and the many small pleasures and annoyances that will shape the actual experience. 3 well-studied causes reliably produce forecasting errors. Focalism, or focal bias. People focus too narrowly on the future event itself and neglect the broader context of their lives. When imagining a breakup, for example, people concentrate on the pain of the separation but forget that later they will go to work, see friends, laugh at jokes, get new hobbies. Ordinary life dilutes the emotional punch. Immune neglect. People underestimate their own psychological coping mechanisms. Humans deploy a set of largely automatic strategies: reframing, downward comparison, seeking social support, and focusing attention on other goals that buffer negative outcomes. Forecasts tend to ignore how quickly or effectively those processes kick in, so predicted suffering is often overstated. Impact bias, including durability bias. People overestimate the intensity and the persistence of their emotional reactions. We imagine that a positive windfall or a setback will transform our happiness baseline for a long time. In reality, hedonic adaptation, returning toward a personal happiness baseline, diminishes the long-term emotional effects of many changes. Other contributors include projection from the present. We project current feelings onto future scenarios, use of coarse semantic knowledge rather than concrete episodic imagery, saying, "I'll be devastated," without imagining specifics, and effect as information, mistaking the ease or vividness of imagined scenarios for how we will actually feel. The hot-cold empathy gap is related. People in a cold state, calm, fail to appreciate how strong visceral drives or emotions will be in a hot state, angry, aroused, and conversely those in a hot state misjudge future cold states. Empirical work, much of it associated with researchers like Daniel Gilbert and Timothy Wilson, has repeatedly shown these effects. Classic comparisons contrast people's predictions about how happy or unhappy they would be after big events, winning the lottery, becoming disabled, gaining or losing a partner, with longitudinal data collected after the event actually occurs. The consistent finding is that predicted emotions are more extreme and longer lasting than experienced emotions. For example, winners of large prizes report immediate highs but often return to baseline levels of happiness faster than they predicted. People who suffer setbacks often recover more rapidly than they anticipated. Laboratory studies using smaller-scale events replicate the same error patterns, which confirms the robustness of the phenomenon across domains and magnitudes. Neuroscience and cognitive psychology provide complementary accounts. Episodic simulation, using memory and imagination to pre-experience a future event, relies on many of the same brain networks used for remembering. That shared machinery explains why forecasting draws on current knowledge and feeling states, but it also explains why forecasts are prone to the same omissions and distortions as memory. Details are lost, context simplified. And affective tags, how something felt before, are reused imprecisely for future scenarios. Brain regions involved in valuation and mental simulation, such as parts of the medial prefrontal cortex and hippocampal networks, appear important for constructing and evaluating imagined futures, but because the simulation is rarely exhaustive, the resulting emotional prediction is imperfect. The practical consequences of affective forecasting errors are widespread. Consumers purchase goods expecting large, lasting increases in happiness, or to avoid pain, and then experience buyer's remorse or rapidly fading satisfaction. People make major life decisions, career changes, relocations, relationships, on the basis of how they think they will feel, sometimes under or overcommitting to paths that turn out to be less emotionally consequential than imagined. In healthcare, patients may misjudge how much relief or burden a treatment will bring. Policymakers and communicators who predict public emotional responses to events or reforms may over or underestimate the electorate's reaction. In short, decisions grounded in faulty affective forecasts can lead to inefficient allocation of time, money, and effort. Because the errors are systematic, there are practical strategies for reducing them. No method is perfect, but several techniques reliably improve forecasting and lead to better choices. Retrieve actual past experiences. Instead of imagining a generic scenario, recall concrete episodes that were similar. How long did the emotional effects last then? What else happened that you forgot to imagine? Memory for actual adaptation is often more diagnostic than guesswork. Make simulations richer and more specific. Mentally simulate not only the core event but the mundane context, your daily routine, likely interruptions, and secondary events. The more detailed the simulation, who, where, when, what else is happening, the less you'll overfocus on the central event. Consider the full-time course. Ask, what will my first day be like, my first week, month, year? Forecast separate short-term and long-term reactions instead of assuming the immediate reaction will persist. Anticipate coping. Explicitly think through how you and others are likely to respond adaptively, who you'll call, what activities will help, how you typically recover from disappointments. Use external informants. Talk to people who've actually experienced the outcome you're considering. Their narrated experience can break focal illusions and reveal adaptation you wouldn't have imagined. Try before you buy, if possible. Sampling, short trials, and staged commitments give real data about how you'll actually feel when you live with a change. Apply probabilistic thinking and premortems. Instead of asking, will this make me happy? Ask, what's the range of likely emotional outcomes and their probabilities? A premortem, imagining ways a decision could fail and how you'd feel, can reveal overconfidence in predicted positives. Look for hedonic baselines and set realistic expectations. Remember the hedonic treadmill, many gains and losses have surprisingly small long-run effects on overall happiness. Use decision rules that don't rely solely on predicted emotion. Weigh objective costs and benefits, social consequences, and values, not just anticipated feelings. Finally, quality of life predictions are sometimes more important than anticipated effect. If the goal is to maximize long-term flourishing rather than immediate affective highs, favor strategies supported by evidence for sustained well-being, social relationships, meaningful work, health behaviors, and use forecasts of feeling as one of several inputs, not the sole arbiter, of choice. Affective forecasting errors reveal a humility-inducing truth: our capacity to imagine the future is powerful but imperfect. We can simulate many possibilities with surprising vividness, yet those simulations routinely omit context, undercount our resilience, and misread the duration of emotional impacts. Recognizing these limits, by anchoring expectations in past experience, enriching scenarios, consulting others, and treating forecasts probabilistically, helps us make choices that are closer to the emotional realities we will actually live through. Choice supportive bias. Choice supportive bias is a cognitive phenomenon in which people retroactively ascribe positive attributes to options they have selected and negative attributes to options they have rejected, thereby justifying or reinforcing the decisions they have made. This bias reflects a subtle, often unconscious distortion of memory and evaluation, serving to protect self-esteem, reduce cognitive dissonance, and maintain a coherent sense of rationality and control over one's choices. Unlike conscious rationalization, choice supportive bias occurs automatically in memory reconstruction. The perception of the decision's outcomes and characteristics is subtly altered to make one's own choices appear better and alternatives appear worse. The underlying mechanisms of choice supportive bias are closely tied to memory reconstruction and selective recall. Human memory is not a perfect recording of events but a reconstructive process influenced by current beliefs, motivations, and emotional states. After making a choice, individuals tend to recall information about the chosen option in ways that highlight its strengths and downplay weaknesses. Conversely, information about unselected alternatives may be remembered as less favorable, with positive features minimized or forgotten. This selective memory enhances the subjective satisfaction with one's decisions and reduces the discomfort associated with the possibility that a different choice might have been superior. In experimental settings, participants who choose between equally attractive items later rate their selected items more favorably than they did initially and rate rejected items less favorably, illustrating the bias in action. Choice-supportive bias is intimately connected with cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when one's actions conflict with beliefs, values, or self-perception. Making a choice inherently involves rejecting alternatives, and if the decision is perceived as potentially flawed, it can generate tension. By unconsciously amplifying the positive aspects of the chosen option and minimizing the attractiveness of rejected options, choice-supportive bias alleviates this tension. This process helps preserve the perception of oneself as competent, rational, and capable of making sound decisions, even when outcomes are uncertain or less than ideal. Emotional factors also play a critical role in choice-supportive bias. Positive emotions associated with a decision can reinforce selective memory and evaluation, while negative emotions about rejected options may exacerbate the tendency to downplay their benefits. In this way, emotional reinforcement intertwines with cognitive processes, creating a feedback loop in which satisfaction with choices is maintained and the threat of regret or self-doubt is minimized. Furthermore, people may overestimate the likelihood of success of their chosen option and underestimate the likelihood of success of the rejected alternatives, further enhancing perceived decision quality. Choice-supportive bias is observed across a wide range of contexts, from consumer behavior to personal relationships, financial decisions, and career choices. For example, a person who purchases a particular smartphone may retrospectively emphasize its features, such as design, performance, or brand reputation, while minimizing flaws or drawbacks. Similarly, someone who chooses a job or educational program may focus on benefits and opportunities while perceiving unchosen alternatives as less attractive or viable. This bias also extends to moral or social decisions, where individuals defend their choices in interpersonal conflicts, political positions, or ethical dilemmas by reconstructing memory and evaluation in ways that favor their selected course of action. Research has identified several cognitive processes contributing to choice-supportive bias. Misattribution occurs when positive experiences or features are incorrectly attributed to the chosen option. Selective forgetting leads individuals to omit or forget negative information about the selected choice and positive information about rejected options. Distorted evaluation occurs when remembered features are reinterpreted in a more favorable light for the chosen option and in a less favorable light for alternatives. Collectively, these processes demonstrate that choice-supportive bias operates at multiple stages: encoding, retrieval, and evaluation of information. The bias has both adaptive and potentially maladaptive consequences. On the positive side, choice-supportive bias can reduce regret, maintain decision satisfaction, and support confidence and commitment to one's actions. These outcomes can be beneficial in situations that require persistence, long-term engagement, or adherence to complex plans. On the negative side, the bias can lead to systematic errors in judgment, reinforcing suboptimal decisions and impairing learning from past choices. By exaggerating the merits of chosen options and the flaws of rejected alternatives, individuals may repeat mistakes, fail to correct poor decisions, or develop overconfidence in future decision-making. Factors that modulate the strength of choice-supportive bias include the difficulty of the decision, the similarity between options, the perceived importance of the choice, and the emotional significance of outcomes. Harder decisions, where options are closely matched, tend to produce stronger bias because the need to justify the selection and reduce dissonance is greater. Decisions with higher stakes or greater emotional involvement also amplify the effect, as the motivation to maintain confidence and satisfaction is stronger. Cultural and individual differences, such as tendencies toward self-enhancement, optimism, or analytical thinking, may further influence the degree to which choice-supportive bias occurs. In experimental psychology, choice-supportive bias is often studied using paradigms in which participants evaluate options, make choices, and later recall or reevaluate features of selected and rejected alternatives. Consistent findings indicate that participants exaggerate positive qualities of chosen options and minimize those of rejected ones, demonstrating that memory and evaluation are malleable and influenced by post-decision processes. Neuroimaging studies suggest that regions involved in reward processing, self-referential thought, and cognitive control are active when individuals engage in post-decision evaluations, supporting the idea that choice-supportive bias involves both affective and cognitive mechanisms. In sum, choice-supportive bias illustrates how human memory, evaluation, and decision-making are influenced by a need to maintain coherence, self-esteem, and emotional comfort after a choice is made. It highlights the reconstructive nature of memory, the interplay between cognition and emotion, and the adaptive functions of bias in promoting satisfaction and confidence. While it can protect individuals from regret and support persistence, it also introduces systematic distortions in perception and evaluation, demonstrating that even post hoc reflections on decisions are not purely objective but shaped by psychological imperatives to see one's own choices in a favorable light. Mental accounting. Mental accounting is the informal, psychological bookkeeping people do when they organize, evaluate, and track financial outcomes and other valued events. Instead of treating money and outcomes as perfectly fungible, which classical economics assumes, people mentally segregate funds and experiences into separate accounts: paycheck, rent, vacation, windfalls, savings, indulgences, and then apply different decision rules to each account. These mental categories simplify complex choices and reduce cognitive load, but they also introduce systematic biases. Money that is identical in objective value is treated differently depending on how it is labeled, where it came from, and how it is framed. At a descriptive level, Richard Thaler's work established three core operations of mental accounting: coding, combining, and segregating, and evaluating. Coding is the act of labeling an incoming or outgoing resource, deciding whether a dollar is groceries, rent, or a gift. Once coded, people decide whether to combine that outcome with other items, treating it as part of a larger fund, or segregate it, consider it a separate windfall or loss. Finally, evaluating means applying a mental rule: spend, save, splurge, or pay down debt, based on the category. These operations are not arbitrary, they stem from heuristics that make decisions tractable by simplifying the stream of transactions into a limited set of meaningful categories. Psychologically, mental accounting arises from bounded rationality and the need to reduce complexity. Creating accounts helps people set short-term goals: this envelope is for groceries, track progress, how much is left for the month, and regulate behavior: don't touch the vacation fund. Emotion and salience shape coding. Unusual or emotionally charged events are given distinctive accounts and treated differently than routine income. Source dependence, the tendency to treat money differently depending on how it was acquired, is central. A tax refund, a paycheck, and a birthday gift are often mentally treated as qualitatively different. Refunds and gifts are more likely to be spent on discretionary items, the splurge money category, whereas wages are treated as funding ongoing obligations. That source-based distinction helps explain common puzzles, such as why people who owe high-interest debt sometimes retain low-interest savings, because the savings are mentally earmarked for a different purpose and not seen as available to pay down debt. Two related cognitive tendencies shape how outcomes are combined or separated. People tend to segregate gains and integrate losses in their mental accounts. This means they prefer to receive multiple small gains separately. Two $50 payments feel better than one $100 payment, but prefer to combine losses into a single hit. A single $100 loss feels less bad than two $50 losses. These preferences follow from loss aversion and diminishing sensitivity in prospect theory. The shape of the value function makes the emotional geometry of sums matter. Hedonic editing summarizes the idea that people arrange outcomes to maximize perceived pleasure and minimize pain. They will partition gains to savor them and lump losses to reduce pain. Mental accounting also explains many consumer behaviors through the pain of paying and payment decoupling phenomena. Payments that are vivid, immediate, and linked directly to consumption, cash, in-person card transactions, produce greater pain and lower spending, whereas decoupled payments, credit cards, subscriptions, separate billing, reduce that pain, increasing purchases. Marketers exploit this. Installment plans, free shipping thresholds, and subscription billing all weaken the linkage between purchase and payment, making spending easier. Gift cards and promotions create artificial accounts, store-specific balances, that encourage higher overall spending than if consumers had received equivalent cash. Empirical research supports these ideas across settings. Laboratory studies and field observations show that people spend windfalls differently than earned income, that labeled savings accounts increase saving for a specific goal, and that consumers treat identical dollars differently based on labels. Classic findings include the overvaluation of transaction utility, favoring perceived bargains over net outcome, and the disproportionate use of mental budgets that prioritize consumption of certain categories. Studies in household finance reveal the practical costs. Mental accounting can produce suboptimal financial behavior, such as keeping emergency cash separate from high-interest credit card debt or failing to reallocate low-yield earmarked savings toward pressing liabilities. The implications are broad. In personal finance, mental accounting can be both a bug and a feature. It becomes a useful self-control mechanism when people deliberately earmark funds. The envelope system, labeled savings buckets, automatic transfers to retirement accounts, to prevent impulse spending. But it becomes dysfunctional when it prevents rational reallocation of resources, when people refuse to use vacation savings to cover an emergent health expense, or when they treat a bonus as free-for-all even while living paycheck to paycheck. In marketing, firms design pricing and payment structures to take advantage of mental accounts, unbundled pricing, rebates framed as separate gains, and play money promotions are all crafted to trigger favorable consumer responses. In public policy, understanding mental accounting informs interventions. Framing a tax as a narrow surcharge versus a general tax affects acceptance. Earmarking charitable donations or retirement incentives can increase participation by creating motivating mental accounts. Neuroscientific and behavioral models complement the behavioral description. People appear to use different neural and cognitive processes for immediate consumption versus reflective budgeting. Emotional salience and short-term reward circuits increase the allure of immediate consumption, while prefrontal planning mechanisms support longer-term mental accounting. But the core point remains psychological rather than purely neural. People rely on mental structures to simplify decisions, and those structures shape preferences and behavior. Because mental accounting is a stable, predictable bias, there are practical strategies to harness it and to mitigate its costs. To use it productively, create explicit accounts for goals you want to protect, a labeled savings account for taxes, an envelope for discretionary spending, and automate transfers so mental earmarking becomes automatic. To avoid costly misallocation, periodically consolidate accounts and review your whole financial picture so you see fungibility where it matters, e.g., paying off expensive debt rather than hoarding low-yield cash. When making big decisions, deliberately reframe outcomes in aggregate rather than through narrow categories. Ask, what's my net position if I combine these accounts, rather than, can I afford this from the entertainment envelope? For policy designers and managers, leverage mental accounting to nudge desirable behavior, automatic enrollment, labeled tax-advantaged accounts, and commitment devices that create mental sunk funds for future use. In short, mental accounting reveals that human economic behavior is not driven solely by cold maximization of fungible resources but by psychologically meaningful categories that organize decisions. These categories help people manage complexity, pursue goals, and exercise self-control, but they also create predictable inefficiencies and opportunities for manipulation. Recognizing the rules of mental accounting, how we code, segregate or combine, and evaluate money and outcomes, lets individuals and institutions design choices that either exploit the bias or guide it toward better outcomes. Projection. Projection is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals unconsciously attribute their own thoughts, feelings, desires, or impulses, often those that are distressing, threatening, or socially unacceptable, to other people. Instead of consciously acknowledging these internal states as their own, people displace them onto others, perceiving in the outside world what actually originates within themselves. This mechanism allows the individual to distance themselves from feelings they find uncomfortable, while simultaneously maintaining a coherent sense of self. The concept originates from psychoanalytic theory, where Sigmund Freud identified projection as one of the ego's defense mechanisms, a tool for protecting the individual from anxiety or inner conflict by relocating forbidden or difficult emotions outward. At its core, projection is rooted in the human difficulty of facing aspects of the self that clash with personal ideals, moral standards, or social norms. For example, someone who harbors hostility or envy but views themselves as a kind and generous person may find it too unsettling to consciously admit to those negative emotions. To resolve this inner tension, the person unconsciously shifts the blame outward, perceiving others as being hostile or envious instead. The hostile feelings remain psychologically alive but are experienced as external threats rather than internal flaws. In this way, projection shields self-image while displacing responsibility. Projection operates along a spectrum. In its mild and everyday form, it shapes ordinary interpersonal perceptions, where people see their own attitudes reflected in others. For instance, a person who is honest and straightforward may assume others are equally trustworthy, while someone who often lies may be suspicious of others' truthfulness. This type of projection is not always defensive but instead arises from the mind's tendency to use one's own inner world as a template for interpreting others. More intense forms of projection, however, clearly function defensively. An individual ashamed of aggressive impulses may become hyperalert to aggression in those around them, interpreting neutral remarks as hostile or perceiving others as threatening. This allows the individual to externalize the uncomfortable emotion. It's not me who is angry, it's them. The mechanism is often unconscious, which makes projection difficult to recognize in oneself. The person genuinely believes the traits, motives, or feelings exist in the other person, which can lead to misunderstandings, conflicts, and distorted social interactions. In relationships, projection can manifest as misplaced accusations or unwarranted suspicion. A person who is unfaithful may become obsessively jealous of their partner, accusing them of infidelity. Someone insecure about their competence may criticize others as incompetent. These dynamics can destabilize trust and communication, since the projected content reflects the projector's inner world rather than the actual behavior of the other. Projection can also take collective or cultural forms. Groups may project their own fears, weaknesses, or socially disowned qualities onto outsiders or marginalized communities, a process that underlies many stereotypes and prejudices. For example, a society struggling with its own aggression might characterize another group as inherently violent, thereby justifying hostility toward them while denying the aggressive impulses within. In such contexts, projection not only distorts perception but also perpetuates systemic biases and conflicts. Research in modern psychology and cognitive science suggests that projection can be explained not only as a Freudian defense mechanism but also as a broader cognitive bias. Humans naturally interpret the minds of others by analogy with their own experiences. Since our own thoughts and emotions are the most immediately available data, the brain often uses them as a model for understanding others. This can lead to accurate empathy when there is true similarity, but it also creates distortions when personal feelings are attributed without evidence. Neuroscientific studies of theory of mind and social cognition suggest that parts of the brain responsible for self-referential processing overlap with those used for imagining the states of others, making projection an almost inevitable byproduct of how we construct social reality. Despite its distorting effects, projection is not wholly maladaptive. It can serve as a psychological buffer, allowing individuals to manage feelings that might otherwise overwhelm them. By externalizing distressing content, the person gains temporary relief and preserves stability of self-concept. However, if relied on excessively, projection can prevent growth and self-awareness, since it blocks recognition of one's true emotions and traits. Left unchecked, it can fuel interpersonal conflict, prejudice, or cycles of blame that hinder healthy relationships and self-development. In therapeutic contexts, uncovering projection is often a crucial step in personal growth. Psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral approaches alike aim to help individuals recognize that the feelings they perceive in others may in fact belong to themselves. Through reflection, confrontation with evidence, and building tolerance for uncomfortable emotions, individuals can reintegrate the projected content into their conscious awareness. This process not only reduces interpersonal friction but also fosters greater authenticity, empathy, and self-acceptance. Projection, then, is both a defense and a distortion, rooted in the interplay between self-image, emotion, and social perception. It shows how humans do not passively see the world as it is but actively color it with their own hidden thoughts and feelings. While it can protect the psyche in moments of tension, true psychological maturity requires turning inward to reclaim what has been pushed outward. Recognizing projection in oneself opens the door to deeper self-understanding and more genuine connections with others. Misattribution of memory. Misattribution of memory is a cognitive phenomenon in which individuals recall information correctly but attribute it to an incorrect source, context, or origin. It represents a fundamental error in the reconstruction of memory, highlighting the distinction between the content of a memory and the processes or circumstances by which that memory was acquired. Misattribution underscores that memory is not a literal recording of past events but a reconstructive process, influenced by perception, attention, prior knowledge, expectations, and subsequent experiences. This phenomenon can manifest in numerous ways, including source confusion, false recognition, and cryptomnesia, and has profound implications for daily life, legal contexts, and our understanding of human cognition. At its core, misattribution occurs because the human brain encodes and stores multiple components of an experience: sensory details, contextual information, semantic content, and emotional tone, often separately. During retrieval, these elements must be integrated to reconstruct the memory, a process prone to error. For example, a person may remember reading an interesting fact but misattribute it to a credible source when, in reality, they learned it from an unreliable website. Similarly, a witness might recall seeing a suspect at a crime scene but incorrectly associate the face with a different location or time. These errors occur not because the memory is entirely fabricated but because the association between content and source is weakened or mislinked. One common form of misattribution is source misattribution, where individuals remember the information itself but confuse its origin. This can involve mistaking who said something, where it was read, or under what circumstances an event occurred. Source misattribution often arises from similar cognitive cues across experiences, insufficient attention at encoding, or the passage of time, which erodes the strength of contextual associations. For instance, hearing a rumor from one friend and later recalling it as information from another friend demonstrates the fluidity of source memory. Another related form is cryptomnesia, in which a person recalls information but believes it is a novel thought or original idea. Cryptomnesia illustrates how misattribution can occur even in the absence of conscious deception. Individuals genuinely believe that they are generating original content when, in fact, it is a memory retrieved without proper source attribution. This is often observed in creative contexts, such as writing, problem-solving, or composing music, where prior exposure to ideas or patterns is unintentionally incorporated into new outputs. Misattribution of memory is closely linked to phenomena such as false recognition and confabulation. In false recognition, a person may confidently recognize a stimulus, such as a face, word, or image, as familiar, even though it was never previously encountered. This can occur because familiarity and recollection are distinct memory processes. Familiarity generates a general sense of prior exposure, while recollection involves retrieving specific details. Misattribution arises when the sense of familiarity is mistakenly tied to an incorrect source or context. Confabulation, often seen in clinical populations with memory impairments, involves fabricating details to fill gaps in memory, frequently accompanied by misattribution errors as the individual attempts to maintain a coherent narrative. Cognitive and neural mechanisms underlying misattribution of memory involve interactions between the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and other memory-related regions. The hippocampus plays a critical role in binding elements of an experience, such as sensory input, spatial context, and temporal sequence, into an integrated memory trace. Disruptions in encoding or retrieval, or interference from overlapping memories, can weaken these associations and increase the likelihood of misattribution. The prefrontal cortex is involved in monitoring and evaluating memory retrieval, supporting source monitoring and reality testing. When prefrontal functioning is compromised, either due to stress, fatigue, or neurological factors, individuals are more susceptible to misattribution errors. Several factors increase vulnerability to misattribution. Time is a key factor. As memories age, their contextual details degrade faster than the core content, leaving the source more ambiguous. Similarity and interference between memories can also lead to confusion, especially when experiences share overlapping features. Attention at encoding plays a crucial role. If attention is divided, contextual associations are weaker, increasing the probability of source confusion. Emotional arousal can both strengthen the core memory and distort source information, sometimes enhancing vividness while simultaneously promoting misattribution. The implications of misattribution of memory are extensive. In legal contexts, eyewitness testimony is particularly vulnerable. Witnesses may confidently recall events but attribute actions or statements to the wrong person or context, contributing to misidentification and wrongful convictions. In educational settings, students may misattribute the source of learned information, leading to plagiarism or inaccurate citation. In social interactions, misattribution can distort personal narratives, interpersonal understanding, and beliefs about past events. Recognizing the reconstructive and fallible nature of memory is therefore critical for evaluating claims based on recollection. Misattribution also interacts with other cognitive biases. For example, confirmation bias may lead individuals to misattribute supporting evidence to credible sources while dismissing conflicting information. Choice supportive bias can exacerbate misattribution by retroactively favoring memories consistent with previous decisions, and familiarity-based errors, such as the mere exposure effect, can make previously encountered information seem novel if its source is misremembered. In sum, misattribution of memory highlights the reconstructive nature of human cognition. Memories are dynamic, integrated, and susceptible to distortion. While the content of a memory may be accurate, the attribution of its source, context, or origin is often fallible, influenced by cognitive limitations, interference, and the passage of time. Understanding misattribution sheds light on the complexities of memory, the interplay between cognition and perception, and the ways in which humans construct coherent narratives from imperfect recollections. Recognizing the prevalence and mechanisms of misattribution is essential for fields ranging from psychology and neuroscience to law, education, and everyday decision-making, illustrating both the adaptability and vulnerability of human memory. Emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the set of capacities and tendencies that allow people to perceive, understand, use, and manage emotions, their own and other people's, in ways that guide thinking and behavior. It's not a single skill but a cluster of related abilities and dispositions, spotting subtle emotional cues in a colleague's tone, calming yourself when you're stressed, using a mood to prime creativity, accurately guessing what a friend is feeling, and choosing how much emotion to show in a tense meeting. Because emotions color almost every human decision, relationship, and moment of learning, emotional intelligence sits at the interface between cognition, motivation, and social life. There are two broad ways psychologists have framed emotional intelligence. One, originating with John Mayer and Peter Salovey, treats EI as an ability that can be measured by performance, perceiving emotions in faces and voices, using emotions to facilitate thought, for example, employing a happy mood to broaden creative associations, understanding complex emotion blends and transitions, and regulating emotions effectively. The other approach, popularized by Daniel Goleman and others, mixes abilities with personality-like traits and social skills, self-awareness, knowing your emotions, self-regulation, controlling impulses, motivation, using emotions to stay goal-directed, empathy, tuning into others, and social skill, managing relationships. Contemporary work distinguishes ability EI, performance-based, from trait EI or emotional self-efficacy, self-reported typical emotional behavior. Both are useful, but they capture different things and relate differently to other constructs like IQ and the Big Five personality traits. How EI operates emerges from several psychological processes. First, perception, detecting emotional signals in faces, posture, voice, or context provides raw information. Second, appraisal and understanding, once perceived, emotions are interpreted, is that anxiety or excitement? And placed into causal narratives, she's quiet because she heard bad news. Third, regulation and use, emotions are shaped strategically, down-regulating anger to preserve a relationship, up-regulating enthusiasm to motivate a team, and harnessed to thinking, using curiosity to guide learning. Fourth, social cognition, recognizing others' emotional states, taking perspectives, and adjusting behavior accordingly. These processes are interactive and recursive. Better perception leads to more accurate appraisals, which enable more effective regulation, which in turn influences social outcomes and creates new emotional input. At a biological level, emotional intelligence maps onto networks that detect, evaluate, and regulate affect. Subcortical systems, notably the amygdala and brainstem arousal circuitry, register emotional salience quickly. Insula and somatosensory regions signal internal bodily states, interoception, prefrontal cortical areas, especially medial and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and dorsolateral regions, support interpretation, cognitive reappraisal, and top-down control. The anterior cingulate participates in conflict monitoring and integrating affective signals with action. Neurochemical modulators, e.g., oxytocin, cortisol, dopamine, shape social sensitivity, stress responses, and reward motivation, so physiology feeds back into emotional skillfulness. In short, EI is grounded in both rapid affective detection and slower executive processes that shape how emotion is used. Measuring EI is complicated because different models imply different assessments. Ability EI is assessed with performance tests that ask people to identify emotions in images or stories and to solve emotion-relevant problems. Trait EI is assessed with questionnaires asking people how they typically respond, e.g., I'm good at calming myself down. Each method has strengths and limitations. Performance measures are less susceptible to self-enhancement bias but rely on scoring rules, which can be contested, while self-reports are easy to administer and predict everyday behavior because they tap people's self-conceptions. But they overlap substantially with personality traits, especially neuroticism, extroversion, and agreeableness. Because of these differences, researchers distinguish what emotional intelligence predicts. Ability EI tends to relate more to objective emotional reasoning and some forms of social performance, while trait EI is a stronger predictor of subjective well-being and typical interpersonal style. Emotion skills develop across the life course and are shaped by early experience. Secure attachment, sensitive caregiving, verbal labeling of feelings, and modeled emotion regulation create the scaffolding for accurate emotion perception and flexible regulation. Schools and programs that teach social and emotional learning, SEL, show that many EI components are teachable. Children can learn to name emotions, use calming strategies, resolve conflicts, and take others' perspectives. Adult EI can also be improved through targeted practice, feedback, coaching, mindfulness training, role play, cognitive reappraisal training, and emotion-focused therapy techniques all produce measurable gains in regulation, awareness, and interpersonal effectiveness. But change takes time and requires repeated practice and supportive environments. EI is partly a skill and partly an expression of temperament and context. Emotional intelligence matters in everyday domains. At work, higher EI is associated with better leadership, teamwork, conflict resolution, and customer relations because emotional skills improve communication and reduce costly interpersonal errors. In education, children with stronger SEL skills show better classroom behavior and learning readiness. In close relationships, emotion recognition and regulation predict relationship satisfaction and adaptive conflict handling. Clinically, deficits in emotion identification and regulation, as in alexithymia or some mood disorders, are linked to poorer mental health. Conversely, interventions that improve emotional awareness and regulation are central in therapies for depression, anxiety, and trauma. That said, EI is not a cure-all. Technical competence, domain knowledge, and cognitive intelligence remain crucial. EI enhances how people use those resources rather than replacing them. There are important subtleties and criticisms to acknowledge. One critique concerns construct clarity and measurement, because self-report EI overlaps with personality. Claims that EI explains work performance or life outcomes, beyond IQ, can be overstated unless models and measures are carefully separated. Ability EI has smaller but still meaningful relations to outcomes and is less confounded with personality, though scoring performance tests, who is correct about an emotional interpretation, raises philosophical questions. Another caution: high EI can be used for both prosocial and manipulative ends. Skilled emotion perception combined with low empathy or unscrupulous motives can facilitate influence that harms others. Dark side uses. Cultural variation matters, too. What counts as emotional competence differs across cultures because appraisal patterns, display rules, and emotion vocabularies vary. Assessments and trainings need cultural sensitivity. Practical strategies for developing emotional intelligence are concrete and evidence-informed. Build emotional vocabulary by regularly naming subtle feelings rather than lumping everything into good or bad. Practice mindful awareness of bodily sensations to improve interoceptive accuracy. This increases sensitivity to early emotional signals. Use cognitive reappraisal, deliberately reframing a situation to change its emotional impact, instead of suppression, which tends to have downstream costs. Increase emotional granularity by distinguishing between similar effects, e.g., frustration versus disappointment, which gives more precise targets for regulation. Practice perspective taking and active listening to strengthen empathy and reduce miscommunication. Seek and use feedback, video-recorded role plays, trusted peers, coaching, to reduce blind spots in how you come across. Finally, create environments that scaffold emotional growth, teams with psychological safety, classrooms that teach SEL skills, and workplaces that value emotion-friendly practices, clear norms for feedback, manageable emotional labor expectations. In sum, emotional intelligence is a multifaceted capacity that knits together perception, understanding, regulation, and social use of emotion. It rests on both rapid affective systems and deliberate cognitive control, develops from early experience and deliberate practice, and influences well-being, relationships, and performance across life domains. It's neither mysticism nor merely being nice. It's a set of identifiable skills and tendencies that can be measured imperfectly, taught thoughtfully, and applied ethically, and, when cultivated alongside technical skills and critical thinking, it makes people more effective actors in the social world. Encoding specificity principle. The encoding specificity principle is a fundamental concept in cognitive psychology that explains how the context in which information is encoded affects the likelihood and accuracy of later memory retrieval. Proposed by Endel Tulving and Donald Thompson in 1973, the principle asserts that memory is most effectively retrieved when the cues present at the time of recall match or closely resemble the conditions under which the information was originally encoded. In other words, the success of memory retrieval depends not merely on the strength of the memory trace itself but on the degree to which the retrieval context reinstates elements of the original encoding context. This principle highlights the intricate interplay between context, cues, and memory, emphasizing that recollection is not simply a matter of storing and accessing information but involves reconstructive processes that rely on associative networks. At its core, the encoding specificity principle recognizes that memories are encoded alongside a variety of contextual features, including the physical environment, emotional state, semantic associations, and internal cognitive states. When an individual learns new information, these contextual elements become integrated into the memory trace, forming a rich associative network. During retrieval, cues that overlap with these original contextual features act as affective triggers, facilitating the reconstruction of the stored memory. For instance, studying vocabulary words in a particular room may enhance recall if the same room or similar environmental cues are present during testing, because the spatial and sensory features of the environment are bound to the memory trace. Conversely, if the retrieval context diverges substantially from the encoding context, recall may be impaired, even if the memory itself is intact. The principle applies to a wide range of contextual factors. External cues, such as location, ambient sounds, lighting, or odors, can enhance retrieval when they match those present at encoding, a phenomenon known as context-dependent memory. Classic experiments demonstrate that divers who learned word lists underwater recalled the words better underwater than on land, illustrating the role of environmental cues in memory. Internal cues, including physiological states, moods, and mental or emotional states, also influence memory retrieval. This is referred to as state-dependent memory, information learned while in a particular mood or under the influence of a specific drug is more readily recalled when the individual returns to a similar internal state. For example, a person who studies while happy may recall the information more easily when experiencing a similar positive mood. Semantic and associative cues are also critical in encoding specificity. Words, concepts, or ideas presented alongside the target information become linked within the memory network. When retrieval cues overlap semantically or contextually with these associated elements, they provide effective access points to the memory. This explains why mnemonic devices, meaningful associations, and elaborative encoding strategies enhance recall. They increase the number and quality of cues that can later trigger the memory. Conversely, cues that are present at retrieval but were not part of the original encoding may be ineffective or even misleading, illustrating that memory is not simply about similarity or familiarity but about the specificity of the relationship between cues and the encoded trace. The encoding specificity principle also helps explain phenomena such as tip-of-the-tongue states and forgetting. When a retrieval attempt fails, it often reflects a mismatch between available cues and the contextual elements bound to the memory, rather than the complete loss of the information. Similarly, false memories or source misattributions can arise when retrieval cues partially overlap with multiple memory traces, activating information from related but incorrect contexts. This illustrates the reconstructive nature of memory and the critical role of cue-context alignment in accurate recollection. Neuroscientific research supports the encoding specificity principle, revealing that memory retrieval involves the reactivation of neural networks that were active during encoding. Functional imaging studies show that areas of the hippocampus and neocortex engaged during learning are often reactivated during successful recall, particularly when the retrieval cues match encoded contextual features. This neural reinstatement underscores the idea that memory is not simply a stored record but a dynamic process in which the overlap between encoding and retrieval contexts facilitates reconstruction. The principle has wide-ranging implications for education, eyewitness testimony, therapy, and everyday memory practices. In educational settings, studying material in multiple contexts or using diverse retrieval cues can enhance later recall across situations, while being aware of context effects can improve exam performance. In forensic psychology, understanding that memory retrieval is context-dependent helps explain why eyewitness accounts may vary depending on questioning environment or emotional state and highlights the importance of minimizing contextual mismatches during interviews. Therapeutic interventions, such as cognitive behavioral techniques or trauma processing, can leverage encoding specificity by helping clients access memories in safe or structured contexts, thereby improving recall or emotional processing. In addition to practical applications, the encoding specificity principle informs broader theories of cognition and memory. It illustrates that memory is deeply relational, reliant on the associations formed between information and its surrounding context. It challenges simplistic notions of memory as a static repository of information, emphasizing instead that successful recollection is a function of cue-dependent reconstruction. The principle also interacts with other memory phenomena, such as the spacing effect, which benefits from repeated encoding in varied contexts, and state-dependent learning, where congruence between internal states at encoding and retrieval enhances memory. In sum, the encoding specificity principle highlights that the effectiveness of memory retrieval is contingent upon the match between cues present during recall and the conditions under which information was originally encoded. Memory is inherently contextual, associative, and reconstructive, with retrieval success dependent not only on the strength of stored information but also on the alignment of environmental, emotional, and cognitive cues. Recognizing this principle allows for the design of strategies to enhance learning, recall, and accurate memory retrieval, while also illuminating the subtle ways in which memory can fail when context and cues are misaligned. Learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a robust psychological phenomenon in which organisms come to expect that their actions have little or no effect on outcomes, and as a result they reduce efforts to change aversive circumstances even when control later becomes possible. It is not simply temporary discouragement, it is a learned expectancy, a cognitive and motivational shift, produced by experiencing uncontrollable events that generalizes across situations and persists, producing passivity, impaired learning, negative mood, and reduced problem solving. The concept illuminates how perceptions of control, or lack thereof, shape behavior, emotion, and cognition, and why people sometimes fail to act in situations where action would change outcomes. The origin of the idea traces to classic experiments by Martin Seligman and colleagues in the 1960s and 1970s. In the canonical animal paradigm, dogs were exposed to electric shocks that they could not escape, inescapable shock. Later, when placed in a shuttle box where escape was possible by jumping a barrier, many of these dogs failed to make escape attempts, they simply lay down passively, apparently having learned that nothing they did mattered. Control groups that had been given prior experience with escapable shocks readily learned to avoid the shock in the shuttle box. Variants of this triadic design, inescapable, escapable, and no-shock/yoke groups, established that it was the prior experience of uncontrollability, not general shock exposure, that produced the failure to learn escape later. Comparable results have been replicated across species and procedures, e.g., rats, primates, humans in laboratory tasks, which helped cement learned helplessness as a general principle about the behavioral consequences of perceived uncontrollability. Mechanistically, learned helplessness involves several interacting components. One is an expectancy or belief about control. After repeated exposure to uncontrollable events, the organism develops the expectation that future actions will be ineffective. This expectation lowers motivation to try and reduces attention to action outcome contingencies, producing a self-fulfilling failure to act. Another component is cognitive. Exposure to uncontrollability can impair subsequent learning about new contingencies. Animals and people show deficits in learning that a response now produces an outcome. A third component is affective. The experience of uncontrollability often produces passive negative mood states analogous to anxiety and depression in humans. These three, motivational, cognitive, and emotional, together characterize the learned helplessness syndrome. Researchers refined the original behavioral account with cognitive formulations. Abramson, Seligman, and Teasdale proposed a reformulation that linked learned helplessness with depression in humans by emphasizing attributional style. According to this model, people who explain failures in terms that are internal, "it's my fault," stable, "it will always be this way," and global, "it affects everything I do," are more likely to generalize helpless expectancies and to develop depressive symptoms following uncontrollable events. In contrast, attributing failure to external, unstable, and specific causes reduces generalization and vulnerability. This attributional perspective helped bridge animal learning findings and human clinical phenomena and stimulated research on explanatory style, pessimism, and resilience. Neuroscience and psychobiology have elaborated pathways by which uncontrollability alters brain and body function. Animal studies implicate stress-sensitive circuits. Exposure to inescapable stressors activates serotonergic neurons in the dorsal raphe nucleus and engages the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal, HPA, axis, producing endocrine and autonomic changes that can influence learning and motivation. Prefrontal cortical regions appear to signal and regulate control. Interventions that restore prefrontal function can mitigate the behavioral effects of uncontrollability. In humans, neuroimaging and psychophysiological studies suggest that perceived lack of control alters activity in networks involved in threat detection. Reward processing and cognitive control, although the precise mechanisms are complex and still actively researched. Importantly, the biological response to uncontrollability is adaptive in many respects, mobilizing resources under threat, but becomes maladaptive when learned expectancies generalize and block effective coping. Learned helplessness is relevant to many real-world domains. In clinical psychology, it provides a theoretical account for aspects of depression and passivity. Patients often describe feeling that their actions will not improve their situation, resulting in withdrawal and reduced engagement in potentially therapeutic activities. In education, children who repeatedly fail despite effort may conclude that trying is futile, leading to disengagement and poor academic outcomes. In workplaces, employees who perceive chronic lack of control or unfairness can become demotivated, reduce initiative, and display learned helplessness that undermines performance. Social contexts such as poverty, discrimination, chronic illness, or abusive relationships can create prolonged experiences of uncontrollability that foster helpless expectancies, with consequences for health, economic behavior, and civic participation. The concept therefore links psychological processes to social and policy issues. Environments that repeatedly deny agency are likely to produce populations less able to seize opportunities even when they arise. Not every person exposed to uncontrollable events develops persistent helplessness. Several moderating factors shape vulnerability and recovery. Prior history of control, having had successful mastery experiences, buffers against learned helplessness. Social support and models of effective action can prevent generalization. Individual differences such as optimistic explanatory style, higher self-efficacy, greater cognitive flexibility, and stronger executive control also reduce susceptibility. The timing, intensity, and duration of uncontrollable events matter. Brief uncontrollability may produce transient effects, whereas chronic, unpredictable, or pervasive uncontrollability is more likely to generalize. Cultural factors influence interpretations of control. In some contexts, communal coping and external locus explanations may mitigate or exacerbate helplessness depending on how agency is socially construed. Because learned helplessness has clear maladaptive outcomes, interventions focus on restoring perceived and actual control and on changing explanatory style and behavior. In clinical practice, cognitive behavioral therapies explicitly target maladaptive beliefs about control, teaching problem-solving skills, graded exposure to achieve small mastery experiences, behavioral activation to increase engagement with reinforcing activities, and cognitive restructuring to replace catastrophic or global attributions with realistic appraisals. Attribution retraining, teaching people to make more adaptive attributions, and training in contingency detection, helping people notice when their actions produce change, are effective components. At the environmental level, designing systems that provide clear, reliable feedback, opportunities for success, and meaningful choices reduces the likelihood of learned helplessness in schools, workplaces, and communities. Prevention emphasizes early mastery experiences, modeling of effective coping, and institutional practices that avoid chronic uncontrollability, e.g., participatory decision-making, transparent procedures. Measurement and empirical research employ both behavioral assays, e.g., escape avoidance tasks, persistence measures, and self-report instruments, e.g., scales of perceived control, locus of control measures, attributional style questionnaires. Laboratory manipulations, such as unsolvable anagrams, impossible puzzles, or uncontrollable noise, have been used to induce transient helplessness in human studies and to test interventions. Longitudinal and field research link chronic uncontrollability to depression, poor adjustment, and health outcomes, although causality in complex natural environments is multifactorial and moderated by many variables. The literature has also generated important critiques and refinements. Early animal work raised ethical concerns and questions about anthropomorphic interpretation. Subsequent failures to replicate some specific effects led researchers to refine definitions, emphasize the role of cognitive mediators, expectancies and attributions, and incorporate stress physiology explanations. Contemporary views treat learned helplessness as one pathway among several leading to depression and motivational deficits, interacting with genetics, temperament, social environment, and life history. From an adaptive standpoint, the tendency to reduce effort when outcomes are uncontrollable can conserve energy and reduce exposure to futile stressors. It may be functional in environments where persistence is costly and uncontrollability is permanent. The problem arises when the expectancy generalizes inappropriately, producing passivity in contexts where action would be effective. Understanding learned helplessness therefore highlights a central tension. Organisms must decide when to persist and when to conserve resources, and this decision process can be skewed by prior experience in ways that are reversible with the right cognitive, behavioral, and environmental changes. Recognizing learned helplessness matters because it points to concrete routes for intervention, teach people to detect contingencies, scaffold repeated small successes to rebuild agency, reframe attributions from global/stable/internal to specific/unstable/external where appropriate, and redesign social structures that routinely deny control. Doing so not only alleviates individual suffering but also enhances learning, productivity, and civic engagement by restoring the basic belief, backed by experience, that what one does can, in fact, make a difference. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation describe two fundamental sources of energy that push people to act, learn, and persist, one coming from inside the person, the other coming from the outside. Intrinsic motivation arises when an activity is pursued for its own sake, because it is interesting, enjoyable, satisfying, or absorbing. You practice the piano because you love the sound and the challenge. You solve puzzles because the mental work itself feels rewarding. You read a book because the story and ideas pull you in. Extrinsic motivation, by contrast, is driven by external outcomes or contingencies, money, grades, praise, approval, avoidance of punishment, or other externally supplied incentives. You work an extra shift for overtime pay, study for a test to get a good grade, or obey rules to avoid getting reprimanded. The distinction matters because these two motivational sources produce different kinds of engagement, quality of learning, and persistence. Intrinsically motivated activity tends to produce deeper engagement, greater creativity, more flexible problem solving, and longer persistence when the external pressures are removed. Extrinsic motivators are often excellent at producing immediate compliance, boosting effort on routine or unattractive tasks, and shaping behavior in predictable ways, but they can undermine intrinsic interest, reduce creativity, and produce short-lived performance when over-relied on. contemporary theory gives a richer account than this simple binary. Self-determination theory, Deci and Ryan, situates intrinsic and extrinsic motivation along a continuum of self-determination. At one end lies a motivation, no motivation, then external regulation, purely external prompts, introject regulation, behavior driven by internal pressures like guilt or ego, identified regulation, person values the behavior and accepts it as important, integrated regulation, behavior is fully assimilated with one's values, and finally intrinsic motivation, activity done for its own sake. This continuum explains how extrinsic reasons can be internalized, how a person can start doing something for pay or approval and eventually come to value it as personally meaningful. The degree to which external incentives are internalized depends heavily on whether the social context supports autonomy, competence, and relatedness, the three basic psychological needs identified by SDT. Environments that are autonomy supportive and provide constructive feedback tend to foster internalization and the development of intrinsic interest. Controlling contexts tend to block internalization and promote compliance without true engagement. Cognitive evaluation theory, a component of SDT, explains how external rewards affect intrinsic motivation through two psychological processes: perceived locus of causality and perceived competence. If a reward is perceived as controlling, I do this because I must to get the reward, it shifts the perceived cause of behavior to the outside and undermines intrinsic motivation. If a reward provides informational feedback, you did well, this shows you're improving, it can enhance perceived competence and sometimes boost intrinsic motivation. This is why the same kind of praise can have opposite effects depending on tone and focus. Process-oriented feedback that emphasizes strategy and improvement tends to support intrinsic motivation. Controlling or person-centered praise, "You're so smart," can create pressure to maintain an image and thus reduce intrinsic interest. Empirical patterns are robust. Classic laboratory work, e.g., Lepper and colleagues, found that children who received unnecessary, tangible rewards for an activity they already enjoyed later showed reduced spontaneous interest in that activity compared with children who received no reward. This is the over-justification effect. In workplace research, extrinsic incentives reliably increase quantity of routine or narrowly defined tasks but often reduce quality, creativity, and long-term commitment when they crowd out intrinsic motives. In education, intrinsic interest in learning predicts deeper processing, better conceptual understanding, and persistence. Extrinsic rewards may increase short-term performance on rote tasks but often fail to foster enduring learning. That said, extrinsic rewards are useful and sometimes necessary. They can start behavior that would not otherwise occur, support learning when tasks are initially uninteresting, and provide structure during skill acquisition until intrinsic interest and competence develop. Task characteristics and reward design matter greatly. For tasks that are boring, unfamiliar, or require a lot of initial effort, well-structured extrinsic rewards can jumpstart action and allow mastery experiences that eventually build intrinsic interest. For tasks that are complex and creative, controlling incentives, strict quotas, close surveillance, reward contingencies that narrow focus, can narrow attention and reduce performance quality. Performance contingent rewards, based on how well someone does, tend to be less harmful than task contingent rewards, pay simply for doing a task, but even performance rewards can be damaging if they are perceived as controlling or if they encourage short-term tactics over deep learning. Culturally and developmentally, there is variation. Young children are often naturally intrinsically motivated to explore. The social framing adults provide influences whether that curiosity becomes internalized learning or extrinsic compliance. Collectivist cultures may place more normative weight on social and relational motives, approval, duty, contributing to group goals, which can be experienced either as externally controlling or as autonomously endorsed depending on whether the values are internalized. Across the lifespan, identity and values play a growing role. Adults commonly pursue work that aligns with personal goals, more autonomous motivation, but economic constraints and social expectations can make extrinsic motive central. Neuroscience adds complementary insight without replacing psychological theory. Brain systems that process rewards, dopaminergic pathways into the striatum and prefrontal circuits, respond to both extrinsic incentives and intrinsic signals such as curiosity, mastery, and learning progress. Moments of insight, signs of improving competence, and intrinsic interest activate similar reward-related circuitry, which helps explain why intrinsically motivated behavior feels rewarding even without external payoff. But the brain-level story is complex. Different networks track novelty, prediction error, social rewards, and long-term value, and motivation is best understood as the outcome of interacting systems, not a single motivation center. Practically, the distinction guides how we design classrooms, workplaces, parenting strategies, and public policy. To foster intrinsic motivation, create autonomy-supportive contexts, offer meaningful choice, acknowledge feelings, avoid controlling language, structure tasks at an appropriate challenge level, balance difficulty with skill so flow and mastery are possible, provide feedback that informs competence, specific, process-focused, non-judgmental, and cultivate relevance by connecting tasks to personal values or goals. When extrinsic rewards are necessary, design them so they do not feel controlling, make them informational rather than coercive, tie rewards to improvement or mastery rather than mere compliance, and phase them out as internal motives develop. Praise effort, strategy, and progress instead of fixed traits. Use social recognition that emphasizes contribution and growth rather than ranking or comparison. Measurement and intervention research typically use a mix of self-report instruments, e.g., intrinsic motivation inventory, academic motivation scale, work extrinsic and intrinsic motivation scale, behavioral measures, choice to continue an activity when no reward is available, and performance outcomes. Interventions that target autonomy and competence, such as project-based learning, job redesign for greater task significance and decision latitude, and motivational interviewing for health behavior change, tend to increase autonomous motivation and produce better long-term outcomes. There are ethical and strategic cautions. Extrinsic incentives can be powerful levers but can also be manipulatively used to produce dependence, narrow goals to short-run metrics, or create unfair pressures. Conversely, insisting that people just do it for the love of it ignores material realities, pay, safety, and legitimate external constraints matter. The most effective approaches recognize the legitimacy of extrinsic needs while designing environments that help people internalize reasons for chosen activities, thus building sustained, high-quality motivation. In short, intrinsic motivation fuels deep engagement, creativity, and enduring persistence because the activity itself is rewarding. Extrinsic motivation is effective for initiating action and shaping concrete behaviors but risks undermining internal drives if it is experienced as controlling. The practical sweet spot is to use extrinsic supports thoughtfully to build competence and meaning, then enable internalization so that motivation becomes more autonomous. Small design choices, how feedback is worded, whether choice is offered, how success is framed, often make the difference between motivating people in ways that stick and motivating them in ways that backfire. Inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is a cognitive phenomenon in which an individual fails to notice a fully visible but unexpected object or event in their visual field because their attention is focused on something else. This failure is not due to problems with eyesight or the object being hidden, rather, it reflects the fundamental limitations of human attention. Even though our eyes can take in a vast amount of visual information at any given moment, our brain does not process everything equally. Instead, attention acts as a selective filter, prioritizing certain stimuli and ignoring others. When attention is deeply engaged in a specific task or directed toward a particular element of the environment, other stimuli, even those that are clear and prominent, can go completely unnoticed. The phenomenon illustrates the difference between seeing and perceiving. People often believe that whatever falls within their field of view is automatically perceived, but this assumption is misleading. Vision is not a passive recording of everything around us, It is an active process in which attention determines what is consciously processed and stored. Inattentional blindness occurs when the mind allocates its limited attentional resources to one task so thoroughly that other aspects of the scene, even salient ones, fail to enter conscious awareness. A classic and widely cited demonstration of inattentional blindness is the invisible gorilla experiment conducted by researchers Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris in 1999. In this study, participants were asked to watch a short video of people passing a basketball and count the number of passes made by players wearing white shirts. While the participants focused on this task, a person in a gorilla suit walked through the scene, paused in the center, thumped their chest, and then exited. Despite the gorilla's obvious presence, about half of the participants did not notice it. This result was astonishing because the gorilla was large, moving slowly, and present for several seconds. Yet because participants were focused on the counting task, their attention filtered out the unexpected element entirely. The underlying mechanism of inattentional blindness can be explained through the concept of attentional capacity. The human brain has limited resources for processing information at any given time. When performing a demanding task, such as monitoring fast-moving objects or making calculations, most of these resources are consumed by the primary task. Unexpected stimuli, even those that would normally seem obvious, fail to trigger awareness because they are outside the attentional set, the mental framework for what the individual expects to see. In the basketball experiment, the attentional set was tuned to players and ball movement, not to an animal-like figure crossing the scene. Inattentional blindness is not a rare occurrence, it happens frequently in everyday life. For example, a driver concentrating on traffic lights or road signs may fail to notice a pedestrian stepping into a crosswalk. Similarly, a person deeply engaged in a phone conversation while walking might not see a friend passing by in close proximity. These lapses are not due to carelessness but rather to the inherent limitations of attention. The phenomenon underscores that what we perceive is not simply a function of where we look but of what we attend to. Several factors influence the likelihood of experiencing inattentional blindness. One is the difficulty of the primary task. The more demanding the task, the less capacity remains for processing unexpected stimuli. Another factor is the relevance of the unexpected object to the task. If the object shares features with the attended items, such as color or shape, it is more likely to be noticed. Conversely, if the object is unrelated or conceptually distant, like a gorilla in a basketball game, detection is much less likely. Individual differences also play a role. Some people may be more prone to inattentional blindness than others due to differences in attentional control, working memory capacity, or situational factors such as fatigue and stress. The phenomenon has important real-world implications. In fields that require high levels of attention, such as aviation, medicine, and law enforcement, inattentional blindness can lead to critical oversights. Pilots may fail to notice a crucial indicator on the control panel during an emergency because their focus is on another problem. Radiologists examining medical images for signs of disease might miss an unexpected but significant anomaly. Police officers in high-stress situations can overlook a weapon in plain sight if their attention is consumed by another perceived threat. These examples illustrate that inattentional blindness is not a trivial curiosity but a cognitive limitation with potentially life or death consequences. Neuroscientific research suggests that inattentional blindness occurs because attention is required for conscious perception. Visual information may reach early stages of processing in the brain, but without attentional allocation, it does not reach the level of awareness. This aligns with theories that consciousness depends on global integration of information across different brain areas, a process that cannot occur for unattended stimuli. Some studies even show that the brain registers the presence of the unexpected stimulus at an unconscious level, indicated by subtle neural responses, yet the person remains completely unaware of it. Perhaps the most striking aspect of inattentional blindness is how confidently people believe they would notice unexpected events. This overconfidence stems from the illusion of attentional capacity, the belief that because something is in view, it will automatically be perceived. In reality, attention acts like a spotlight that illuminates only a small part of the scene, leaving everything else in shadow. The rest of the visual field may seem clear and detailed, but much of that sense of clarity is an illusion constructed by the brain. Understanding inattentional blindness is crucial for improving safety, designing better user interfaces, and training individuals in professions that demand sustained attention. Strategies such as minimizing task complexity, using salient warning signals, and creating structured attentional checks can help mitigate its effects. However, because inattentional blindness reflects fundamental properties of attention, it can never be completely eliminated. In sum, inattentional blindness reveals a profound truth about perception: we do not see everything we look at, and our awareness of the world is far more limited than it feels. It is a reminder that attention, not vision alone, defines the boundaries of conscious experience. Change blindness. Change blindness is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals fail to notice significant changes in their visual environment, even when those changes occur in plain sight. This failure to detect alterations is not due to a flaw in vision but rather a limitation in attention and the way the brain processes information. Human perception is not a perfect recording of reality. Instead, it relies on selective attention to filter and prioritize what seems most important at any given moment. Because attention is limited, the mind cannot process every detail in the visual field simultaneously. As a result, when a change occurs in an unattended region or during a brief disruption, such as a flicker, a blink, or a shift in gaze, people often overlook it completely, even when the change is large and should, in theory, be obvious. At the heart of change blindness lies the assumption most people hold about their own perception, the belief that they experience the world as a detailed, continuous image. In reality, the brain constructs a coherent representation of the environment by stitching together fragments of visual information. It does not store every detail, but rather focuses on general features, objects of interest, and the gist of the scene. This strategy is efficient because maintaining a fully detailed mental picture of the entire visual field would require enormous cognitive resources. However, this efficiency comes at a cost. When the brain does not encode specific details of the environment, changes to those details can go unnoticed if they do not draw attention through motion or relevance. Experiments on change blindness often reveal just how dramatic this limitation is. In a classic demonstration, participants view two alternating images of the same scene with a brief blank screen inserted between them. When a small but significant change is introduced, such as the removal of an object, a change in color, or the alteration of a person's clothing, viewers typically fail to detect it for an extended period, even though they are actively trying to find the difference. This occurs because the visual system relies on motion and transience, sudden shifts, to alert attention to changes, and the brief blank screen masks these cues. Without those signals, the brain assumes continuity and does not scrutinize every element of the scene. Change blindness is not confined to laboratory settings, it happens frequently in everyday life. For instance, someone engaged in a conversation may not notice that the person they are speaking to has been replaced by another individual if the switch happens during a brief distraction, such as bending down to pick something up. This type of experiment, known as the door study, famously demonstrated that many people fail to detect even a change in the person they are directly interacting with when attention is disrupted. Similarly, drivers may fail to notice that a pedestrian has stepped into a crosswalk if the person entered the scene while the driver's attention was on the traffic light or another vehicle. These real-world examples highlight that change blindness can have serious consequences for safety and decision-making. The phenomenon is closely tied to the concept of attentional limits. Our attentional resources are finite, meaning we can only focus on a small fraction of the available information at any moment. When attention is narrowly allocated to one aspect of a scene, other elements become vulnerable to neglect. This does not mean the visual system is weak, rather, it is optimized for efficiency, focusing on what seems most relevant for immediate goals. However, when unexpected changes occur outside the spotlight of attention, they can pass unnoticed because the brain never encoded the original state of those details strongly enough to compare it with the new state. One important implication of change blindness is that perception is not as complete and accurate as people assume. Most individuals believe they see everything in their environment clearly, but experiments reveal that their mental representation is far more limited. The sense of a rich, detailed visual world is partly an illusion created by the brain, which fills in gaps and maintains the impression of stability. This illusion fosters overconfidence in our ability to detect changes, making the phenomenon both surprising and counterintuitive. The mechanisms underlying change blindness have been studied extensively in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. Research suggests that detecting change requires both the storage of an original representation and the ability to compare it with new input. If the original details were never encoded, or if they quickly decay from working memory because they were deemed irrelevant, the comparison cannot occur, and the change goes unnoticed. Neural evidence indicates that even when changes occur outside conscious awareness, the brain may register some difference at an unconscious level, but without attention, this signal does not reach awareness. Change blindness has practical implications in many fields, including aviation, medicine, law enforcement, and user interface design. Pilots might fail to notice a critical change on an instrument panel during high workload conditions, or radiologists may overlook subtle changes in medical images if their attention is guided elsewhere. In eyewitness testimony, people often believe they would notice obvious changes during a crime, yet change blindness research shows that confidence does not predict accuracy. Understanding this phenomenon is therefore essential for designing systems and procedures that minimize the risks associated with attentional limitations. At a deeper level, change blindness challenges intuitive notions of perception and consciousness. It suggests that our awareness of the world is not based on a full and continuous representation but is instead constructed dynamically, relying on attention to select what matters most. The brain trades completeness for efficiency, which usually serves us well, but under certain conditions, it leaves us blind to changes that seem, in retrospect, impossible to miss. Bounded rationality. Bounded rationality is a foundational concept in psychology, economics, and decision science that describes the inherent limitations on human decision-making. It challenges the classical notion of full rationality, the idea that individuals always make optimal choices by comprehensively evaluating all available information, weighing probabilities accurately, and maximizing utility. Instead, bounded rationality recognizes that human cognitive capacities are finite, that information is often incomplete or ambiguous, and that the environments in which decisions are made are complex and dynamic. Consequently, people make decisions that are rational within the bounds of their cognitive limitations, time constraints, and informational constraints, but these decisions may deviate from the idealized standard of perfect rationality. The concept was most prominently introduced by Herbert A. Simon in the mid-20th century, who argued that while humans strive to make rational choices, they are constrained by limitations in attention, memory, computational ability, and foresight. Unlike a hypothetical, economic man, who can calculate and optimize in all scenarios, real human decision-makers operate under what Simon described as satisficing conditions. Rather than searching exhaustively for the absolute best option, they settle for solutions that are good enough to meet their goals or requirements. This approach reflects a pragmatic adaptation to cognitive and environmental constraints, emphasizing efficiency and feasibility over perfect optimization. Bounded rationality arises from several interacting factors. First, cognitive limitations restrict the amount of information a person can process simultaneously. Human working memory can only hold a finite number of pieces of information at one time, and long-term memory is imperfect, prone to bias, decay, and distortion. Second, information is rarely complete or perfectly reliable. Individuals often make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, ambiguity, and incomplete knowledge. Third, decision-making occurs within temporal constraints. Choices often must be made quickly, without time to fully analyze all possible options and consequences. Fourth, the complexity of real-world problems, including multiple interdependent variables, dynamic conditions, and feedback loops, exceeds the brain's capacity for exhaustive calculation. Because of these constraints, people rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, and rules of thumb to navigate complex decisions. Heuristics allow rapid and often effective judgments but can introduce systematic biases and errors. For example, the availability heuristic leads individuals to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled or vividly remembered, while the representativeness heuristic causes them to judge probabilities based on perceived similarity rather than actual statistical prevalence. Bounded rationality provides a framework for understanding why heuristics, despite their departures from strict logical rationality, can be adaptive. They allow individuals to make reasonably effective decisions under real-world cognitive and informational limits. Satisficing, as a central strategy within bounded rationality, illustrates the practical implications of the concept. Rather than exhaustively evaluating every alternative, a decision-maker sets an aspiration level or threshold for acceptability and chooses the first option that meets or exceeds this criterion. This approach balances the cognitive cost of search with the benefits of finding better alternatives. In complex or uncertain environments, satisficing often leads to outcomes that are sufficiently effective without requiring extensive computation, deliberation, or perfect knowledge. It reflects a trade-off between optimality and practicality, highlighting the distinction between theoretical rationality and feasible human reasoning. Bounded rationality has profound implications for understanding behavior across multiple domains. In economics, it explains why people deviate from the predictions of classical utility-maximizing models, such as failing to diversify investments optimally. Exhibiting loss aversion, or overweighing recent outcomes. In organizational decision-making, bounded rationality accounts for procedural routines, hierarchical delegation, and rule-based decision processes, which reduce cognitive load and facilitate coordination even if they do not guarantee optimal outcomes. In everyday life, it illuminates why people rely on habits, traditions, social norms, or expert advice to navigate choices that are otherwise overwhelming or cognitively costly. Research in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics has empirically demonstrated bounded rationality through numerous findings. For instance, studies show that individuals often ignore statistical base rates when making probabilistic judgments, overreact to salient but irrelevant information, and exhibit anchoring effects where initial information disproportionately influences subsequent decisions. In addition, framing effects, where the presentation of equivalent choices in different ways leads to different decisions, illustrate how bounded rationality interacts with cognitive processing limitations and context-dependent evaluation. These patterns highlight that human decision-making is constrained not by randomness, but by the structured ways in which cognitive limitations interact with environmental complexity. Neuroscientific investigations further support the concept, revealing that decision-making engages multiple, distributed brain regions, each with limited processing capacity. Prefrontal areas are associated with deliberation, planning, and working memory, while limbic regions mediate emotional evaluation and reward processing. Under time pressure or high complexity, the brain often relies on more automatic, heuristic-driven pathways rather than exhaustive calculation, consistent with the bounded rationality framework. This neural evidence underscores that limitations in cognitive architecture are not merely a practical inconvenience but fundamental determinants of how decisions are made. Bounded rationality also emphasizes the role of institutions, rules, and environmental design in shaping decision outcomes. Because individuals cannot process all relevant information perfectly, external structures, such as standardized procedures, checklists, nudges, or expert systems, can guide behavior toward better outcomes. For example, tax software simplifies complex rules to facilitate correct filing, and default options in retirement plans help individuals save effectively despite limited attention and planning capacity. These interventions recognize the bounded nature of human rationality and leverage it to improve decision-making in contexts where errors are costly. In summary, bounded rationality presents a realistic and nuanced model of human decision-making. It acknowledges that while people strive to make rational choices, cognitive limitations, incomplete information, time constraints, and environmental complexity constrain their ability to achieve perfect optimization. Individuals compensate for these constraints through heuristics, satisficing, and reliance on external structures, producing decisions that are rational within practical bounds rather than theoretically ideal. By emphasizing the interplay between human cognition and environmental complexity, bounded rationality bridges psychology, economics, and organizational theory, offering a framework for understanding both the strengths and systematic limitations of human reasoning in real-world contexts. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a central and deeply influential idea in psychology that describes the uncomfortable psychological state that arises when a person holds two or more cognitions, beliefs, attitudes, values, or pieces of knowledge that are inconsistent with one another, or when one's behavior conflicts with one's beliefs or self-image. That discomfort, experienced as tension, arousal, unease, or embarrassment, creates a motivational drive to reduce the inconsistency and restore a sense of internal coherence. Far from being a mere intellectual curiosity, dissonance shapes how people think, remember, decide, justify, and act. It helps explain everything from why people rationalize bad purchases to why they cling to beliefs in the face of contradictory evidence. The classic formulation of the theory, originally proposed by Leon Festinger in the 1950s, rests on a few simple ideas. First, holding inconsistent cognitions produces an aversive psychological state. Second, people are motivated to reduce that aversive state and achieve consonance, psychological harmony. Third, when direct change of the dissonant cognition is difficult, people will attempt alternative routes to reduce the tension, by changing behavior, by changing one of the conflicting cognitions, by adding new cognitions that justify the inconsistency, or by trivializing the importance of the conflict. For example, someone who smokes even though they believe smoking causes cancer might quit, change behavior, downplay the risks, the evidence isn't clear, adopt new cognitions, my grandfather smoked and lived to 90, or convince themselves the pleasure outweighs the risk, trivialize. Any of these strategies reduces subjective dissonance by increasing consonant cognitive relationships or decreasing the importance of the inconsistency. Several conditions determine how strong the dissonance will be and which reduction strategy people choose. Important factors include: A. The magnitude of inconsistency. Conflicts among highly valued beliefs produce more dissonance than minor contradictions. B. The proportion and importance of consonant versus dissonant cognitions. More dissonant elements or fewer supportive beliefs increase tension. C. Perceived freedom of choice. Dissonance is stronger when people freely choose a counterattitudinal behavior than when they feel coerced, because free choice implies personal responsibility. D. Foreseeability of negative consequences. If a person could foresee that their action would conflict with their beliefs, dissonance is greater. And E. Centrality to self-concept. Conflicts that challenge one's sense of being honest, competent, or moral provoke especially strong dissonance. Together these variables help predict when dissonance will be felt strongly and when minor rationalizations will suffice. The empirical literature contains a handful of classic paradigms that illustrate the phenomenon. In the forced compliance paradigm, Festinger and Carl Smith, 1959, subjects performed a boring task and were then asked to tell another participant the task was interesting. Those paid only a small amount, $1, later reported that they actually liked the task more than those paid a large sum, $20. The logic is that $1 was insufficient external justification for lying, so participants changed their internal attitude to reduce dissonance, $20 provided adequate justification, so less attitude change was necessary. In the free choice or post-decisional paradigm, Brehm, 1956, people who choose between two similarly attractive options later rate the chosen option more favorably and the rejected option less favorably, a phenomenon called choice-induced attitude change, because enhancing the chosen option and devaluing the rejected reduces regret and dissonance. The effort justification paradigm, Aronson and Mills, 1959, shows that people who endure severe initiation rites for a group tend to value the group more afterwards. The harsh effort creates dissonance, suffering versus meager payoff, that is reduced by increasing the perceived value of the group. Festinger's field study, When Prophecy Fails, demonstrated how committed group members responded to disconfirmed predictions by doubling down or adding rationalizations. Again, efforts to reduce dissonance between belief and reality. Mechanistically, cognitive dissonance entails arousal plus motivation. Contemporary neuroscience and psychophysiology have linked dissonance to conflict monitoring and affective response systems, the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, associated with cognitive conflict detection and error monitoring, and regions implicated in affective and evaluative processing show activity during dissonance-inducing tasks. Physiological arousal, increased skin conductance or heart rate, often accompanies the dissonant state. These signals are thought to recruit prefrontal control systems that implement reappraisal or behavioral change. In short, the brain detects a mismatch and then mobilizes cognitive and emotional resources to reduce the discomfort. Over time, the theory has been refined and integrated with other constructs. One important extension emphasizes the role of self and identity. Dissonance is particularly aversive when it threatens one's self-image, e.g., I am honest, I am competent. Aronson and others argued that dissonance arises when actions conflict with an image of the self, producing motivated cognition aimed at protecting that self-concept. Self-affirmation theory offers a related perspective, allowing a person to affirm an unrelated valued aspect of the self can reduce the need to resolve dissonance directly. By bolstering overall self-integrity, the person can tolerate the inconsistency more easily. Cognitive dissonance interacts with many other phenomena and has broad applications. It explains post-purchase rationalization. We convince ourselves our expensive car was the best choice. Political and religious belief persistence. People reinterpret facts to fit commitments. Moral disengagement and hypocrisy. We downplay harms we cause to preserve a moral self-view, and the processes by which people adopt or resist behavior change messages. Practitioners exploit dissonance intentionally in interventions. Induced hypocrisy techniques, for example, ask people to publicly endorse a norm and then recall occasions when they violated it. The discomfort often motivates subsequent behavior change, e.g., increased condom use, energy-saving behaviors. In marketing, understanding dissonance helps manage buyer's remorse. In therapy, bringing inconsistencies into awareness and guiding adaptive resolution is central to cognitive-based treatments. The theory is not without challengers and refinements. Boehm's self-perception theory, 1967, argued that people infer their attitudes from observing their behavior, without invoking an uncomfortable arousal state. This account can explain some findings attributed to dissonance, especially when initial attitudes are weak. Empirical work has attempted to distinguish the two, where dissonance predicts attitude change accompanied by physiological arousal and where free choice and importance matter most. Evidence tends to support a dissonance explanation, where behavior observation can account for change without arousal. Self-perception may suffice. Modern treatments see self-perception and cognitive dissonance as complementary, with the former applying when attitudes are vague and the latter when commitments and self-views are stronger. Ethical and cultural considerations also matter. Cross-cultural research suggests that the content and resolution of dissonance can vary. In collectivist cultures, the salient dissonance may involve social harmony or group obligations, and people may resolve inconsistencies by changing behavior to match the group rather than by reshaping private attitudes. Nonetheless, the basic sensitivity to inconsistency appears widely human, even if the form of resolution reflects cultural values. Practically, Understanding cognitive dissonance gives tools for both self-management and social influence. To resolve dissonance adaptively, acknowledge the inconsistency, reweight the importance of the cognitions realistically, obtain new information, change behavior where feasible, or practice self-affirmation to reduce defensive rationalization. To avoid maladaptive rationalizations, cultivate curiosity and skepticism about justifications that spring up easily after decisions. And design environments for learning, workplaces, public policy, that reduce avoidable conflicts between values and actions, thereby reducing defensive, self-protective distortions and promoting genuine behavior change. In sum, cognitive dissonance describes a fundamental human drive for internal consistency and the many cognitive, emotional, and behavioral strategies people use to achieve it. It explains why people revise beliefs, reinterpret events, and sometimes persist in error. The mind prefers a coherent story, even if that story bends facts, over the uncomfortable alternative of acknowledging contradiction. Recognizing the mechanisms and manifestations of dissonance helps illuminate ordinary irrationalities and offers principled ways to encourage change, improve decision-making, and foster personal honesty with oneself. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is one of the most pervasive and deeply ingrained cognitive biases in human psychology. It refers to the unconscious tendency for individuals to favor, interpret, and remember information in a way that supports their pre-existing beliefs, assumptions, and expectations, while simultaneously downplaying, ignoring, or rationalizing away evidence that contradicts them. This bias does not operate in a neutral fashion. It actively shapes perception, memory, and reasoning processes, resulting in a distorted view of reality that feels entirely logical and objective to the individual experiencing it. At its core, confirmation bias arises because the human mind seeks coherence and stability. When a person forms a belief, whether it is based on personal experience, cultural upbringing, education, or intuition, the mind tends to protect that belief from contradiction. This tendency is rooted in cognitive consistency theory, which suggests that humans experience psychological discomfort, known as cognitive dissonance, when confronted with information that challenges their mental frameworks. To reduce this discomfort, individuals instinctively favor evidence that fits their current worldview and minimize or reinterpret evidence that threatens it. For example, someone who strongly believes that a specific diet is effective will likely notice and share success stories about that diet, while disregarding scientific studies that demonstrate its ineffectiveness or highlight potential health risks. Confirmation bias operates at multiple stages of the information processing cycle: attention, interpretation, and memory. In terms of attention, individuals selectively focus on information sources that align with their beliefs. A person who supports a particular political ideology, for instance, may primarily consume news from media outlets that share that perspective, thereby reducing exposure to contradictory arguments. When it comes to interpretation, the bias affects how ambiguous information is understood. If a news report presents mixed evidence, individuals tend to interpret the unclear details in a way that favors their prior stance. Even memory is not immune. People tend to recall details that support their opinions with greater clarity and frequency, while inconvenient facts fade over time or become rationalized as exceptions. This bias is particularly insidious because it often feels like objective reasoning from the inside. People experiencing confirmation bias do not usually believe they are ignoring evidence; rather, they believe they are applying critical thinking to weigh the facts. The problem is that their weighing process is skewed. They assign more credibility to supportive information and greater skepticism to contradictory evidence, demanding higher standards of proof for anything that challenges their view. This double standard can be subtle, such as requiring multiple independent confirmations for an opposing claim but accepting a single anecdote as proof for their own stance. The consequences of confirmation bias are profound and widespread. In personal decision-making, it can lead individuals to make poor choices, such as staying in an unhealthy relationship because they only notice moments that seem to confirm the partner's affection, while ignoring signs of neglect or abuse. In the medical field, doctors may fall victim to diagnostic errors if they cling too strongly to an initial hypothesis and interpret new symptoms through that lens, missing critical alternative explanations. In the legal system, investigators and jurors can misinterpret evidence to fit preconceived notions of guilt or innocence, leading to wrongful convictions or acquittals. In science, researchers may unconsciously design experiments or interpret data in ways that confirm their hypotheses, a phenomenon known as experimenter bias, which can compromise the objectivity of scientific inquiry. Social and technological factors amplify confirmation bias in the modern world. The rise of algorithm-driven platforms, such as social media and personalized search engines, creates environments where individuals are repeatedly exposed to information that reflects and reinforces their existing beliefs. This phenomenon, often referred to as an echo chamber or filter bubble, intensifies ideological polarization and reduces opportunities for balanced discourse. When people rarely encounter opposing viewpoints, or encounter them only in distorted, caricatured forms, they become more entrenched in their beliefs and more dismissive of alternative perspectives. Over time, this reinforcement can lead to extreme certainty and resistance to change, even when faced with overwhelming contradictory evidence. Neurologically, confirmation bias can be linked to reward mechanisms in the brain. Studies using neuroimaging have shown that when people encounter evidence that supports their beliefs, regions associated with reward and pleasure become activated. In contrast, disconfirming information often activates regions associated with conflict and negative emotion. This biological feedback loop strengthens the tendency to seek validation and avoid contradiction because confirming information feels satisfying, while disconfirming evidence feels uncomfortable and threatening. Essentially, the bias is not just a flaw in reasoning, it is emotionally and neurologically rewarding to be right, even if that sense of rightness is illusory. Despite its deep roots, confirmation bias is not insurmountable. It can be mitigated, though never completely eliminated, through deliberate cognitive strategies. These include actively seeking out opposing viewpoints, practicing intellectual humility, and using structured methods of decision-making that force the consideration of alternative hypotheses. In scientific research, peer review and replication serve as systemic checks against confirmation bias, though even these mechanisms are not foolproof. On a personal level, cultivating awareness of the bias and a willingness to tolerate discomfort can help individuals resist the seductive pull of certainty and remain open to revising their beliefs when warranted. Ultimately, confirmation bias reflects a fundamental tension in human cognition, the desire for accuracy versus the need for psychological comfort. While accuracy requires embracing complexity and uncertainty, comfort often comes from simplicity and consistency. Confirmation bias tips the scale toward comfort, allowing beliefs to persist even in the face of contradictory reality. Understanding this bias, its mechanisms, consequences, and remedies, is essential for improving critical thinking, decision-making, and the quality of discourse in both personal and societal contexts. Emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals unconsciously catch the emotions of others, experiencing feelings that mirror or are influenced by the emotional states of those around them. Unlike deliberate empathy, which involves a conscious effort to understand and resonate with another person's emotional state, emotional contagion operates automatically and often below conscious awareness. It highlights the inherently social nature of human emotion, reflecting both the brain's capacity for rapid emotional attunement and the evolutionary benefits of shared affect within groups. At the core of emotional contagion is the principle that human beings are wired to respond to social and emotional cues in ways that promote coordination and survival. When someone expresses joy, anger, fear, or sadness through facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, or even subtle physiological cues, observers tend to unconsciously mimic these signals. This mimicry is not limited to overt gestures, research has demonstrated that simply observing the facial expressions of another person can produce corresponding microexpressions, muscular activations, and physiological changes in the observer, such as altered heart rate, skin conductance, or hormone levels. These somatic and neural responses, in turn, trigger a congruent emotional experience, creating a feedback loop in which the observer comes to feel something similar to what the other person is experiencing. Neuroscientific research suggests that emotional contagion relies heavily on the brain's mirror neuron system and related networks involved in social cognition. Mirror neurons fire both when an individual performs an action and when they observe someone else performing the same action, supporting the internal simulation of another's behavior and emotional state. The amygdala, insula, and anterior cingulate cortex are also implicated, mediating the perception of emotional expressions and the physiological resonance that underlies shared affect. This neural architecture allows people to rapidly and automatically detect subtle emotional cues, enabling the transmission of affect across social groups in real time. Emotional contagion occurs in a wide range of contexts, from intimate personal interactions to large-scale social environments. In close relationships, couples and families often unconsciously align their moods. A partner's stress or happiness can ripple through the household, shaping the emotional tone of shared experiences. In organizational settings, leaders' emotions can significantly influence employees' attitudes and performance. Optimistic and positive leaders tend to inspire engagement and productivity, while negative or anxious leaders can propagate stress and disengagement. Public spaces and social gatherings provide further examples. The collective mood at a sporting event, concert, or protest often amplifies individual emotional responses, creating a sense of shared excitement, tension, or solidarity. The mechanism of emotional contagion is particularly pronounced under conditions of uncertainty or social ambiguity. When individuals are unsure how to interpret a situation, they are more likely to look to others' emotional reactions as a guide. This aligns with broader principles of social influence, where people use the observed behavior and affect of others to calibrate their own responses. For example, in emergency situations, individuals often assess danger based on the fear or calmness displayed by surrounding people. Similarly, in learning or group problem-solving contexts, observing frustration, enthusiasm, or confidence can subtly influence one's own emotional state and motivation. While emotional contagion can promote social cohesion and coordination, it can also have negative consequences. In groups, negative emotions such as anxiety, anger, or panic can spread rapidly, amplifying stress and impairing judgment. Financial markets provide a notable example. Traders' fear or exuberance can ripple through trading floors and networks, contributing to market volatility or irrational herd behavior. In personal life, exposure to chronic negative emotions from friends, family, or colleagues can impact mental health, increasing the risk of stress-related disorders or depressive symptoms. The phenomenon can also create feedback loops, where the spread of emotion reinforces itself, leading to escalating emotional intensity within a group. Several factors modulate the likelihood and strength of emotional contagion. Proximity and exposure matter. The closer and more prolonged the interaction, the greater the contagion. Similarity and empathy enhance transmission. Individuals are more susceptible to emotions expressed by people they perceive as similar, familiar, or socially important. Expressiveness and intensity of the original emotional signal also play a role. Exaggerated or salient cues are more readily detected and mimicked. Conversely, people with higher emotional regulation skills, or those consciously attempting to maintain effective boundaries, can resist or moderate the influence of others' emotions. Emotional contagion intersects with other social and cognitive phenomena. It underpins elements of social proof, as people infer norms and appropriate behaviors from the emotions expressed by others. It complements empathy and perspective-taking, providing a rapid, embodied basis for understanding and responding to others' feelings. It also interacts with mood-dependent cognition, an observer's induced emotional state can bias perception, memory, decision-making, and judgment in ways that mirror the original source of the contagion. Understanding emotional contagion has practical implications in multiple domains. In leadership and management, awareness of emotional transmission can guide the cultivation of positive workplace climates. In healthcare, recognizing how caregiver emotions affect patients' well-being informs approaches to bedside manner and patient interaction. In education, teachers' enthusiasm or anxiety can shape students' engagement and performance. In digital communication, the phenomenon extends to social media, where exposure to emotionally charged posts, images, and videos can influence users' mood and even behavior, contributing to viral content and online social dynamics. Ultimately, emotional contagion illustrates that emotions are inherently social and interactive, not purely individual experiences. The automatic, often unconscious sharing of affect facilitates coordination, empathy, and social bonding but also exposes individuals and groups to the rapid spread of negative or maladaptive emotions. Recognizing the mechanisms, triggers, and consequences of emotional contagion allows individuals to harness its benefits while mitigating potential harms, fostering environments where emotions contribute constructively to collective and personal well-being. Illusory correlation. Illusory correlation is the human tendency to perceive a relationship between two variables when no such relationship, or a much weaker one, actually exists. In plain terms, we see patterns or links where there are none, or we exaggerate the strength of relationships that are only weakly present. This is a fundamental cognitive error that shapes how people form beliefs about people, events, and cause and effect, and it underlies many social misperceptions, superstitions, and persistent myths. The effect arises from ordinary memory and attention processes that privilege what is distinctive, emotionally charged, or repeated. Two kinds of distinctiveness are particularly powerful. First, unusual events are more memorable than mundane ones. A rare accident, an extreme failure, or an extraordinary success will stick in the mind long after ordinary, frequent occurrences have faded. Second, minority categories are distinctive relative to majority categories. When a member of a numerically small group behaves in a way that is also notable, for example, a person from a minority group committing a negative act, the pairing of minority plus negative behavior is doubly distinctive. Because distinct pairings produce stronger mental traces, people later overestimate how often the pairing occurred. This mechanism was elegantly demonstrated in classic social psychology experiments where participants read lists of behaviors performed by members of two groups, one majority, one minority. Later, participants systematically overestimated the frequency of negative behaviors by the minority group even though the actual frequencies were equal. That specific finding, first reported by Hamilton and Gifford, 1976, shows how simple encoding and retrieval biases generate seemingly rational but incorrect inferences about group characteristics. Several cognitive biases feed into illusory correlation. The availability heuristic makes vivid or easily retrieved examples seem common. Confirmation bias leads people to notice and remember evidence that supports an existing belief while ignoring contradictory data, and the tendency to form causal narratives encourages us to link events that occur together even if the association is spurious. Together, these biases create a fertile ground for false associations. A single dramatic coincidence, a celebrity's tweet followed by a market drop, say, can anchor a belief that the two are related, and subsequent selective attention will reinforce that link. Statistical ignorance compounds the problem. People frequently neglect base rates and sample size considerations. Small samples produce more variable outcomes and therefore more apparent, but unreliable, patterns. Regression to the mean is often misinterpreted as a causal connection. When an outlying performance is followed by a more typical one, observers may attribute the change to intervening actions, a fix or curse, rather than to natural statistical fluctuation. In short, our intuitive pattern detectors are poorly calibrated for randomness and noise, especially when strong emotions or social meanings attach to the events. Illusory correlations are socially consequential because they help create and sustain stereotypes. If observers overremember negative behaviors by members of a minority group, they will infer that the group as a whole is more prone to those behaviors. Once a stereotype exists, it changes how people attend to and interpret subsequent information, again producing confirmation bias and selective memory, and it becomes self-reinforcing. Subtyping, treating contradictory instances as exceptions, also protects the stereotype from correction. Beyond stereotyping, illusory correlations feed rumors, conspiracy thinking, and superstitions. Repeated pairings, even accidental ones, between two events can lead people to believe in causal links where none exist. Experimental evidence for the phenomenon is robust and cross-domain. Laboratory studies show that even when objective frequencies are equal across categories, participants produce biased frequency estimates favoring distinctive pairings. Field data and real-world examples abound. People overestimate the connection between vaccines and rare adverse outcomes when those cases are highly publicized. Sports fans infer a causal relationship between wearing a lucky jersey and team wins because the wins are remembered and the losses forgotten. Consumers associate particular products with success or failure based more on memorable advertising pairings than on objective performance. Neuroscientific perspectives suggest that brain systems involved in salience detection, emotional tagging, and associative memory, including hippocampal and salience network regions, prioritize encoding for unusual or emotional pairings, although the full neural story is complex and still being mapped. Because the causes are multiple, strategies for reducing illusory correlations must be multi-pronged. Statistical education is foundational, teaching people to attend to base rates, sample size, and regression to the mean reduces susceptibility. Slow, analytic thinking helps, deliberately querying whether a remembered pairing is representative, asking for objective counts, and testing hypotheses rather than relying on anecdote. Structuring information so that counterexamples are salient can mitigate stereotype formation, expose people to individuating information about members of a category, encourage contact with counter-stereotypical individuals, and highlight systematic data rather than isolated stories. In organizations and legal contexts, record-keeping and blind review procedures help prevent single dramatic incidents from disproportionately shaping evaluations. For public communication, repeating accurate base rate information and making statistics concrete, absolute frequencies rather than percentages, visualizations that show sample size, can blunt the pull of salience. Illusory correlation is not simply a pathology, it is a byproduct of adaptive cognitive shortcuts. Rapidly detecting regularities in the environment was useful in ancestral contexts, better safe than sorry when a noisy pattern might indicate a predator. Those same heuristics, however, yield many false positives when applied to complex, noisy social data. Recognizing the adaptive origins of the bias helps explain its persistence and why simple admonitions to think rationally rarely suffice. Practically, then, the takeaways are concrete. When evaluating whether two things are truly related, don't rely on vivid anecdotes, check base rates and sample sizes, look for systematic evidence, consider how memorable the pairing was it rare, emotionally intense, and actively seek disconfirming cases. In social contexts, countering illusory correlations requires emphasizing individuating information and statistics, creating opportunities for contact and meaningful interactions that undermine simple pairings, and training people in statistical reasoning so they can tell true patterns from attractive illusions. Loss aversion. Loss aversion names a striking regularity in human decision-making: losses hurt more than equivalent gains please. In other words, the psychological impact of losing a sum, an opportunity, or a resource is larger than the impact of gaining the same amount. This asymmetry is not a rhetorical flourish but a robust pattern found across laboratory experiments, economic choices, consumer behavior, and everyday life. It sits at the heart of prospect theory, the descriptive account of choice under uncertainty developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which formalized how people evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point and gave loss outcomes a heavier negative weight than equally sized gains. The phenomenon is best understood as part of a larger package of reference-dependent preferences. People do not assess outcomes by their final wealth level alone. They compare outcomes to a reference point, the status quo, an expectation, or some salient benchmark. A gain relative to that point produces positive utility, a loss produces negative utility, and the utility function is steeper for losses than for gains. Put concretely, the displeasure of losing $100 tends to outweigh the pleasure of gaining $100. Because evaluation depends on a reference, changing what counts as the baseline can flip a gain into a loss and dramatically alter choices. This is why framing matters so much. Classic demonstrations make the effect feel intuitive. When people are endowed with an object, a coffee mug, a lottery ticket, or a concert ticket, they typically demand substantially more money to give it up than they would be willing to pay to acquire it in the first place. This endowment effect is commonly interpreted as an expression of loss aversion. Possession turns potential relinquishment into a perceived loss, which looms larger than the non-loss that would be surrendered. Similarly, in risky choices, people commonly display the reflection effect. They are risk-averse when considering gains, preferring a certain smaller gain to a risky larger one, but risk-seeking when facing losses, preferring a risky chance to avoid a sure smaller loss. Both behaviors flow from the same asymmetry. Avoiding a loss is more compelling than realizing an equivalent gain. Loss aversion has deep practical consequences. In markets, it helps explain why sellers often price items higher than buyers expect, why investors hold losing stocks too long, disposition effect, and sell winners too early, and why people overinsure against small risks. In negotiation and politics, threats to an established entitlement provoke stronger resistance than offers of equivalent new benefits. People will sometimes accept a worse final position to avoid feeling they have given something up. For public policy and behavior change, the principle suggests that loss-framed messages, e.g., "You will lose X if you don't vaccinate," can be more effective than gain-framed ones in certain contexts, though the optimal frame depends on the audience and the behavior being targeted. Why does loss aversion arise? Several complementary explanations exist. Evolutionary and adaptive accounts propose that losses, for example, losing food, shelter, or social standing, often carried heavier fitness costs than equal magnitude gains carried benefits, selecting for a bias that prioritizes avoiding harm. Cognitive emotional accounts emphasize that losses trigger stronger affective and physiological responses, higher arousal, negative emotion, and attentional focus, than gains, so they dominate deliberation. Neural studies support the idea of asymmetric processing. Brain regions implicated in negative affect and threat signaling react strongly to prospective losses, while reward circuits respond to gains, giving an integrated neuroeconomic picture of asymmetrical valuation. Whatever the precise mechanism, the upshot is the same: people overweight losses when forming preferences. Despite its robustness, the empirical magnitude and universality of loss aversion have been debated. Laboratory estimates typically find that losses are weighted substantially more than gains, often roughly twice as heavy, though the exact factor varies with methods. Stakes, cultural background, and how researchers elicit choices. Some recent work has shown that loss aversion can shrink or disappear under certain elicitation techniques or when outcomes are bundled, and cross-cultural studies suggest heterogeneity in strength. Measurement issues matter: willingness to pay versus willingness to accept gaps, the role of transaction costs, and how reference points are set can all influence observed effects. These nuances do not erase the reality of asymmetric loss sensitivity, but they remind us that the phenomenon is context-sensitive rather than an immutable law. Loss aversion also interacts with other cognitive biases and decision rules. It supports status quo bias, the tendency to stick with the current option, because switching often implies giving something up. It fuels sunk cost effects, where people persist with failing endeavors because abandoning them feels like admitting a loss. It shapes temporal decisions. Immediate losses can loom disproportionately compared to delayed gains, complicating savings, dieting, or exercise behaviors. Marketers and policymakers exploit these tendencies. Limited time discounts framed as "don't miss out" leverage loss aversion, while default rules, opt-out enrollment, harness status quo bias to increase participation in programs such as retirement savings or organ donation. Because loss aversion can lead to systematically suboptimal choices, several strategies can mitigate its influence. Reframing outcomes to shift the reference point, presenting an action as avoiding a loss versus as gaining a benefit, can change behavior. Chunking or aggregating decisions can reduce the salience of individual losses, for example, grouping minor fees to make them less vivid. Using pre-commitment devices and default settings can bypass moment-by-moment emotional responses. Encouraging deliberation and perspective-taking, asking people to consider long-term consequences or to imagine how they would feel about the outcome in the future, can dampen the immediate sting of loss. Transparent accounting, monetizing future losses or benefits, and probabilistic thinking also help by making trade-offs more explicit and less driven by emotional salience. In sum, loss aversion reveals a fundamental asymmetry in human valuation. The mind treats losses and gains differently, weighting losses more heavily and anchoring choices to reference points that make what is given up painfully salient. This asymmetry explains a wide array of economic and everyday behaviors, from why people cling to what they have, to why certain persuasive frames work, to why markets and institutions show inertia. Recognizing the force of loss aversion allows us both to predict behavior better and to design interventions, ethical nudges, better choice architectures, and educational tools that help people make decisions more aligned with their long-term goals rather than the immediate pull of avoiding loss. Mood-Congruent Memory. Mood-congruent memory is a cognitive bias in which a person's current emotional state acts as a filter for the kinds of memories that become most readily available. Rather than memory being a neutral, objective record of past experiences, it is intimately intertwined with the emotional state of the person recalling it. When someone is in a particular mood, whether happy, sad, anxious, angry, or calm, the brain tends to preferentially retrieve memories that are consistent with that mood. Thus, when a person feels happy, cheerful memories of successes, friendships, and joyful events are more easily accessed. When a person feels sad, memories of losses, failures, or times of rejection are more likely to surface. This is not simply coincidence but a deeply ingrained psychological mechanism that reflects how memory and emotion are neurologically linked. The phenomenon can be understood through the way the brain encodes and organizes experiences. Memories are not stored as isolated units, they are encoded with contextual information, including the emotions that accompanied the original experience. The limbic system, particularly the hippocampus and amygdala, plays a crucial role in this process. The amygdala tags experiences with emotional significance, while the hippocampus organizes these experiences into retrievable memory traces. When a person re-enters an emotional state similar to the one they experienced before, the brain's neural networks for that state are reactivated, making it easier to retrieve memories encoded with similar affective tones. This means that emotional states function almost like retrieval cues for memory. Being sad pulls forward memories of sadness, while being joyful brings forth memories of joy. This has powerful consequences for how people perceive both the past and the present. Mood-congruent memory can create a feedback loop, where the mood influences memory recall, and those memories then reinforce the mood. For instance, when someone is anxious, they may recall other times when they were afraid, uncertain, or overwhelmed, which in turn validates and intensifies their current anxiety. Similarly, a positive mood allows people to access optimistic memories, creating a reinforcing cycle of confidence and hope. This cyclical quality can make moods either self-sustaining or self-destructive, depending on whether they are positive or negative. The phenomenon has been studied extensively in both experimental and clinical settings. Researchers have demonstrated that when participants are induced into a certain mood, say, through sad or happy music, they are more likely to recall words, stories, or personal experiences that match the induced mood. Clinical observations further support this effect. In depression, for instance, mood-congruent memory contributes to the dominance of negative recollections. Depressed individuals often report that positive memories feel distant, inaccessible, or vague, while negative ones come to mind vividly and easily. This selective recall perpetuates feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness, showing how mood-congruent memory can directly impact mental health. On the other end of the spectrum, people in elevated or manic states may overemphasize memories of triumph and joy, creating an inflated sense of self and unrealistic optimism. In everyday life, this phenomenon can explain subtle patterns in thought and behavior. It is the reason why a small disappointment, like a difficult day at work, can lead someone to dwell on a string of unrelated failures, as if their whole life were filled with setbacks. Likewise, it explains why, during a time of happiness, the mind tends to minimize problems and instead conjure memories of resilience, laughter, or affection. The emotional color of the present moment shades not only the immediate perception of reality but also the remembered texture of the past. This makes mood-congruent memory a central factor in how people construct their sense of identity and continuity, since the memories most accessible at any time help define who I am and how my life has been. Importantly, mood-congruent memory should be distinguished from mood-dependent memory, with which it is often confused. Mood-dependent memory refers to the idea that memories are more easily retrieved when the emotional state during recall matches the emotional state during encoding, regardless of whether the memory content is positive or negative. For example, if someone learned a list of neutral words while feeling sad, they would remember them better when sad again. Mood-congruent memory, in contrast, is about the content of the memory being aligned with the current emotional state. Sad moods cue sad memories, happy moods cue happy memories. The two phenomena overlap but describe distinct mechanisms. Overall, mood-congruent memory reveals the profoundly subjective and dynamic nature of human recollection. Memory is not a passive archive of events but an active, constantly shifting reconstruction, filtered through emotional states. This psychological process shows how much the past is colored by the present and why emotions exert such a powerful grip not only on how we feel but on what we believe about our own history. It is a reminder that our remembered past is not a fixed truth but a mood-shaped narrative, one that can either support resilience and optimism or trap individuals in cycles of negativity, depending on the emotional state that dominates at the time of recall. Negativity bias. Negativity bias is a fundamental psychological principle describing the tendency of humans to give greater attention, weight, and influence to negative information, experiences, or stimuli than to positive or neutral ones of equivalent intensity. This bias manifests across perception, cognition, emotion, memory, and behavior, shaping how individuals evaluate events, form judgments, and respond to their environment. Unlike mere pessimism or a generalized negative outlook, negativity bias reflects an asymmetrical processing of information. Bad events, losses, threats, and criticism disproportionately impact thoughts, emotions, and actions relative to good events of the same magnitude. The origins of negativity bias are deeply rooted in evolutionary pressures. For early humans, survival often depended more on rapidly detecting, evaluating, and responding to threats, predators, hostile individuals, poisonous foods, or environmental hazards, than on noticing positive opportunities. Missing a threat could have catastrophic consequences, whereas failing to immediately notice a reward was generally less lethal. As a result, cognitive and attentional systems evolved to prioritize negative or threatening stimuli, enhancing vigilance, rapid response, and learning from adverse outcomes. This evolutionary framework helps explain why humans show heightened sensitivity to loss, danger, or criticism, even when such stimuli are rare or relatively minor in objective terms. Negativity bias operates at multiple levels of cognition and perception. In attentional processes, negative stimuli capture focus more quickly and hold attention longer than neutral or positive stimuli. For example, people are faster to detect angry faces among neutral expressions than vice versa, and images or words with threatening content tend to dominate visual or cognitive processing. Memory is similarly affected. Negative events are encoded more deeply and recalled more vividly than positive events of comparable intensity. This effect, sometimes called the emotional memory advantage, means that a single negative experience, such as criticism, failure, or loss, can have lasting psychological impact, whereas comparable positive experiences may fade from memory more quickly. Emotional responses also reflect the asymmetry inherent in negativity bias. Negative emotions such as fear, anger, and sadness are generally more intense and persistent than positive emotions elicited by equivalent stimuli. Neurologically, this corresponds with heightened activation of the amygdala and related threat detection circuits in response to negative cues, while the neural systems processing positive stimuli, such as reward pathways in the striatum, often produce weaker or less enduring responses. The heightened salience of negative stimuli also interacts with learning and decision-making. People tend to adjust future behavior more in response to losses, punishments, or mistakes than to equivalent gains, rewards, or successes. Negativity bias has broad implications for social cognition and interpersonal behavior. Humans are more likely to notice, remember, and react to negative social signals such as disapproval, anger, or rejection than to positive social cues like praise or acceptance. This can amplify social anxiety, conflict sensitivity, and emotional reactivity in group settings. In communication and media, negativity bias explains why bad news, criticism, or sensational events disproportionately dominate attention, influence opinions, and spread through social networks. Headlines emphasizing danger, scandal, or disaster capture more clicks and evoke stronger emotional reactions than neutral or positive news, reinforcing cycles of collective attention to negative content. The bias also shapes judgment and decision-making. People often overweight potential losses relative to gains, evaluate risks more pessimistically than objectively warranted, and give disproportionate influence to negative feedback when forming assessments or preferences. In organizations, employees may focus more on criticism than praise, managers may overreact to negative performance indicators, and investors may react disproportionately to adverse market events. Even in personal life, negativity bias can exacerbate relationship conflicts, self-criticism, and rumination, as negative experiences dominate attention and memory relative to positive interactions. Despite its potential drawbacks, negativity bias is not purely maladaptive. It promotes caution, risk assessment, and preparedness in uncertain or dangerous environments. It facilitates learning from mistakes, avoiding threats, and maintaining vigilance in dynamic social and ecological contexts. The problem arises when the bias operates in contexts where threats are low, or information is abundant and mostly neutral or positive. In modern society, where physical threats are often minimal but negative information is abundant via media and social networks, the evolutionary advantage of heightened sensitivity to negativity can translate into anxiety, stress, and distorted perceptions of risk or reality. Several moderating factors influence the strength of negativity bias. Individual differences, including personality traits like neuroticism or optimism, affect sensitivity to negative stimuli. Contextual factors such as stress, ambiguity, or social comparison can amplify the bias, while cognitive strategies such as mindfulness, reframing, and deliberate attention to positive experiences can attenuate it. Cultural factors also play a role. Societies and subcultures that emphasize caution, social conformity, or problem-focused attention may exhibit stronger collective negativity bias, whereas cultures that encourage positive reinforcement and optimism may moderate its effects. Negativity bias intersects with other cognitive phenomena. It is closely linked to loss aversion in prospect theory, attentional biases in anxiety and mood disorders, and emotional contagion in social networks. It can exacerbate confirmation bias by making negative evidence more salient and memorable, thereby reinforcing pre-existing concerns or fears. Conversely, awareness of the bias allows for deliberate interventions, focusing on positive feedback, structuring environments to highlight accomplishments, and designing media and communication to balance negative and positive content can counteract the disproportionate influence of negative information. In sum, negativity bias reveals a fundamental asymmetry in human perception, cognition, and emotion. The mind gives priority to negative over positive stimuli, influencing attention, memory, learning, and decision-making. Rooted in evolutionary survival mechanisms, the bias promotes caution and threat avoidance but can also distort judgment, amplify anxiety, and skew social perception in modern contexts. Recognizing and understanding negativity bias provides insight into individual and collective behavior, highlights the interplay between emotion and cognition, and suggests practical strategies for mitigating its disproportionate effects in daily life, work, and societal decision-making. Prospect theory. Prospect theory is a groundbreaking framework in behavioral economics and psychology that describes how people make decisions under conditions of risk and uncertainty, challenging the traditional assumptions of classical economic theory that humans are fully rational agents who always maximize expected utility. Developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1979, prospect theory provides a descriptive model that captures the systematic ways in which real-world decision-making deviates from the predictions of expected utility theory. Its insights revolve around how individuals evaluate potential gains and losses, how they perceive probabilities, and how the framing of choices affects behavior. At the core of prospect theory is the observation that people do not evaluate outcomes solely in terms of their absolute final wealth or utility. Instead, they assess outcomes relative to a reference point, which often corresponds to their current state or expectations. Gains and losses are defined in relation to this reference point rather than by absolute magnitude. One of the most striking findings in prospect theory is loss aversion. Losses loom larger than equivalent gains. This means that losing $100 feels more psychologically painful than gaining $100 feels pleasurable. The value function in prospect theory, which describes the subjective value of gains and losses, is concave for gains, reflecting diminishing sensitivity, and convex for losses, with a steeper slope for losses than gains. This asymmetry explains a wide array of observed behaviors, including the endowment effect, risk aversion for gains, and risk-seeking in the domain of losses. Another critical component of prospect theory is probability weighting. People do not treat probabilities linearly. They tend to overweight small probabilities and underweight moderate to high probabilities. This cognitive distortion helps explain why individuals purchase lottery tickets, overweighting the extremely small chance of winning, and buy insurance, overweighting the very small chance of a catastrophic loss. Rather than computing expected utility as a simple mathematical expectation, the human mind transforms probabilities according to a nonlinear weighting function, giving disproportionate influence to unlikely but salient events. Prospect theory also emphasizes the framing effect, which occurs when the way a choice is presented influences decision-making, even when the underlying outcomes are equivalent. A classic example involves a medical decision. People are more likely to choose a treatment described in terms of survival rates than one described in terms of mortality rates, even if the statistical information is identical. This illustrates that human decisions are sensitive not only to the content of outcomes but also to the cognitive and emotional context in which they are presented. Framing effects demonstrate that preferences are constructed in context rather than revealed consistently across different descriptions of the same choice. The theory distinguishes between two phases in decision-making, the editing phase and the evaluation phase. During the editing phase, individuals simplify and organize available options, often by coding outcomes as gains or losses relative to a reference point, combining probabilities, or eliminating dominated alternatives. This cognitive preprocessing shapes the eventual choice set. In the evaluation phase, people apply the value function and the probability weighting function to assess the subjective desirability of options and make a selection. These phases explain why seemingly irrational behaviors, such as rejecting a fair gamble or overpaying for insurance, emerge systematically from the interaction of cognitive processes rather than from random error or lack of intelligence. Prospect theory has profound implications across economics, finance, marketing, and public policy. In financial markets, it helps explain why investors exhibit loss aversion, holding losing stocks too long and selling winning stocks too early, a behavior known as the disposition effect. In consumer behavior, it accounts for why people are more responsive to promotions framed as avoiding a loss than as achieving a gain, and why limited time offers or penalties can strongly influence purchasing decisions. In public policy, understanding prospect theory allows for the design of choice architectures that nudge behavior effectively, such as framing energy savings as a gain or taxes avoided, thereby harnessing the asymmetric sensitivity to gains and losses. Neuroscientific evidence supports the psychological underpinnings of prospect theory. Brain imaging studies indicate that regions associated with reward processing, such as the striatum and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, respond differently to gains and losses, reflecting the asymmetrical valuation described by the theory. Areas linked to negative affect, such as the amygdala and insula, are more active during potential losses than during equivalent gains, providing a neural basis for loss aversion and the heightened emotional impact of negative outcomes. Probability weighting is also reflected in neural patterns, with unusual or extreme probabilities eliciting amplified responses in attention and valuation circuits, consistent with the overweighting of rare events. While prospect theory has been highly influential, it is descriptive rather than normative. It explains how people actually make decisions, not how they should if they were perfectly rational. Nevertheless, it provides a powerful framework for understanding systematic deviations from expected utility and for predicting behavior in real-world contexts where uncertainty and risk are pervasive. Extensions of the theory, such as cumulative prospect theory, incorporate more sophisticated handling of multiple outcomes and continuous probability distributions, further refining its explanatory power. In summary, prospect theory reveals that human decision-making under risk is shaped by reference points, loss aversion, nonlinear probability perception, and contextual framing. It demonstrates that people are not consistent maximizers of objective utility but are guided by cognitive and emotional heuristics that systematically influence choices. By capturing these patterns, prospect theory bridges psychology and economics, offering a nuanced understanding of behavior that has reshaped research in finance, marketing, policy, and beyond. It underscores that human rationality is bounded and context-dependent, emphasizing the interplay between perception, emotion, and cognition in shaping decisions under uncertainty. Social proof. Social proof is a psychological principle that describes the tendency of individuals to look to the behavior and actions of others to guide their own decisions, especially in situations of uncertainty or ambiguity. At its core, social proof reflects the deeply ingrained human need for social validation and the assumption that the behavior of others provides accurate information about what is correct, appropriate, or effective. This principle is rooted in social influence and is one of the most powerful heuristics people use when navigating complex environments where they lack complete information. The mechanism of social proof operates on both cognitive and emotional levels. Cognitively, it functions as a shortcut for decision-making. Instead of independently evaluating all possible options, individuals infer that if many others are engaging in a behavior, it is likely the right thing to do. Emotionally, following the group reduces feelings of anxiety and risk that arise when making uncertain choices. This tendency was adaptive throughout human evolution because conforming to group behavior often enhanced survival by ensuring that individuals adopted strategies that had proven successful for others in the group. In modern society, this same tendency influences choices in domains ranging from consumer behavior to moral judgments and political opinions. Classic demonstrations of social proof can be observed in everyday life. When a person walks into an unfamiliar restaurant and sees it crowded with diners, they are likely to infer that the food must be good. Similarly, when a product displays thousands of positive reviews online, potential buyers perceive it as trustworthy and high quality. These inferences occur rapidly and often without conscious deliberation. Social proof becomes even more powerful in ambiguous or high-risk situations. For instance, during emergencies, people often look to the reactions of others before deciding how to respond. If others remain calm, an individual may interpret the situation as safe, even if there are warning signs of danger. This phenomenon helps explain why crowds sometimes fail to react quickly to crises, a diffusion of responsibility compounded by reliance on social cues. Research in social psychology has explored multiple forms of social proof. One prominent distinction is between informational influence and normative influence. Informational influence occurs when individuals follow others because they believe those others possess superior knowledge or insight. This is common when the environment is ambiguous, such as when people rely on the ratings of experts or peer reviews to choose a product. Normative influence, on the other hand, reflects the desire to fit in and avoid social disapproval. In this case, people conform even when they privately disagree, simply to align with perceived group norms. The principle of social proof was extensively studied by Robert Cialdini, who identified it as one of the core principles of persuasion. According to Cialdini, marketers and advertisers frequently exploit social proof to influence consumer behavior. Examples include highlighting best-selling items, showing testimonials from satisfied customers, and displaying metrics like most popular choice or over 1 million sold. Such strategies leverage the implicit assumption that popularity signals quality and correctness. Social proof is particularly effective when certain conditions are present. One critical factor is uncertainty. The less confident individuals feel about what to do, the more likely they are to rely on others. Another factor is similarity. People tend to follow those they perceive as similar to themselves in terms of demographics, values, or circumstances. For example, a person deciding which college to attend might give greater weight to opinions from peers of the same age rather than from authority figures. A third factor is number of others. The more people engaging in a behavior, the stronger the social proof. This is why viral trends, whether in fashion, social media, or financial markets, can grow exponentially. Each new participant serves as additional evidence that the behavior is correct or desirable. While social proof is often useful, it is not infallible. It can lead to maladaptive outcomes when the majority behavior is based on misinformation or collective error. Historical examples of such failures include financial bubbles, where individuals invest heavily simply because others are doing so, ignoring fundamental indicators of risk. Social proof can also perpetuate harmful social norms, such as discrimination or unhealthy behaviors, when these are widely practiced within a group. Additionally, digital environments amplify social proof through metrics such as likes, shares, and follower counts, which can be manipulated to create the illusion of popularity or consensus. This dynamic has fueled the spread of misinformation, where false claims gain credibility simply because many people appear to endorse them. Neuroscientific studies suggest that social proof is linked to brain regions associated with reward processing and social cognition, such as the ventral striatum and medial prefrontal cortex. When individuals align with group opinions, these regions show heightened activity, indicating that conformity is experienced as rewarding. Conversely, deviating from group norms can activate brain areas associated with conflict and negative affect, reflecting the social cost of nonconformity. These neural findings reinforce the idea that social proof is not merely a rational heuristic but also an emotionally and biologically grounded process. In practical terms, understanding social proof has broad implications for marketing, public policy, and behavioral design. Marketers use it to increase conversions by showcasing customer testimonials, ratings, and usage statistics. Public health campaigns leverage social proof by framing behaviors such as vaccination or recycling as widespread and normative. However, ethical considerations arise when social proof is manufactured or exaggerated, as this can mislead consumers and distort genuine social consensus. Ultimately, social proof illustrates the social nature of human cognition. Our judgments and behaviors are not made in isolation but are deeply intertwined with the perceived choices of others. While this reliance on social cues often leads to efficient and adaptive decisions, it also makes individuals susceptible to collective errors and manipulative practices. Recognizing the influence of social proof, and critically evaluating whether the majority is truly correct, remains an essential skill for maintaining autonomy in a world saturated with social signals.